Chapter 17. Crisis of Chicanery. Year 0002, May 15th. The soldier, and occasionally Turk, cafeteria was deserted when Kunzel pushed open the doors. Eyebrows raised to his hairline, he tapped the screwdriver he'd left to retrieve against his thighs as he looked around. There had been at least a half-dozen people lounging around when he'd been there a few minutes ago. Shrugging, he ran a hand through his short, sandy blonde hair. His helmet was still on the counter in the kitchen, next to the partially dismantled microwave he'd been trying to repair. It beat waiting for the piles of paperwork to go through so Shinra could hire a mechanic to come break it further. It was always like that around here, he thought sourly. If it wasn't cactuar spikes in the food processor, it was Marlboro slime in the sinks. He was almost 100% sure that something monster-related was the cause of the malfunctioning microwave. It's just what happened when he shared space with several dozen superpowered soldiers. He even knew for a fact that the tomboy really had been let loose in the kitchen as a prank. He wasn't sure if it actually stole the chef's knife, but that wasn't too important. Watching Zack freak out over anything tomboy-related for weeks afterwards had made it hilarious. His boots echoed against the hardwood floor as he wove through the deserted chairs and tables, making his way to the kitchen door. It gave easily under his palm as he pushed it inward, and he was struck again by the lack of personnel. There should have at least been a few cooks procrastinating in a corner. The one in charge of soups always hid a sewing magazine in the middle of his copy of Girl Next Door. Kunzel's well-honed information-detecting skills were acting up, which was why he was already wedged in the corner next to the entrance to the kitchen when the main doors to the cafeteria burst open. He heard the sound of several sets of footsteps moving into the other room, though they were lighter than the usual heavy-booted treads of his fellow soldiers. "See? Told you I cleared it out. Man, Singh, you gotta learn to trust me," a drawling voice said loudly in the silence. "Cameras." This voice was a low rumble. "Of course I took care of them, partner. What do you take me for? This place is clean." A pause, then. "Well, except for whatever gunk is growing in the sinks. I think the soldiers are trying to prank the Prez's chef again." "Renault," a female-sounding voice sighed. "We're all too tired for your antics." "That's no way to talk to your superior, Shotgun." "Yet you do it to me all the time." This voice was quiet, smooth, and male. Kunzel heard the sound of legs dragging against the floor as they were pulled back. It was a risk, but he edged a little closer to the door and pushed it open just a scant centimeter. Through the small space, he was able to make out several figures, all wearing the familiar dark suit of the Turks. He recognized Singh, having seen the man on the soldier floor more than a few times. He often worked with Zack, Kunzel knew, and the two had a sort of friendship. The redhead was Renault, and the third in the Turk food chain, only beneath Director Vell and Tseng. He was partnered with the bald-headed, dark-skinned Rude. The two women were a little harder to place, but Kunzel wasn't a renowned information and gossip collector for nothing. Cisne, or sometimes Shuriken, was one of the most crush-worthy ladies in Shinra, according to the gossip networks. Many of the soldiers liked to say she was the hottest around. The other woman had long, light-colored hair in a ponytail, and was called Shotgun. He had relatively little information on her. She'd only been with the Turks for around a year now, and was from Medeal, or so he'd heard. The daughter of fairly wealthy big-game hunters, and a dab hand with her preferred weapon. She'd apparently done well during her first mission, which had gotten out of control. The rest was heavily classified, unfortunately. Such a gathering of Turks in a supposedly empty room could only mean this was some sort of secret meeting, then. Kunzel grinned to himself. Zack often said he was more of a Turk than a soldier, so maybe it was time he started sitting in on their meetings. So long as they didn't think to check the kitchen again before they left, he could be patient and wait them out.
I didn't expect you to call us in, boss, Renner said, his boots thumping on the table as he tilted his chair back onto two legs. I don't think I've even seen a strand of blonde hair since last month. Tsing set a few folders on the table and gave Renault's boots a pointed look. I have. The recent mission I shared with Cloud brought to light a few more curiosities. Kunzel was nearly beside himself in a combination of excitement and worry. It wasn't good that the Turks were talking about Zack's little shadow, but he couldn't deny he was dying of curiosity to know more about the kid. Zack was surprisingly tight-lipped about the whole deal, and had fallen into a comfortable routine almost too quickly to be believed. For a while, Kunzel had wondered if his friend really was sleeping with the blonde. That line of thought had been quickly crushed, as anyone with eyes could both see Zack's adoration for his girlfriend. Pretty, with long brown hair, he'd seen her once or twice, as well as Cloud's obtuseness to the rumors and innuendos that floated around. Given Cloud's general distaste about the rumors, when he did acknowledge them, he did wonder how much of it was feigned. Renault had taken his boots down so he could lean forward, and his chair thumped loudly against the floor. "Ooh, intriguing," he said, grinning a shark-like grin. "Sounds like you got to do all the fun stuff, and left the paper pushing to me and Rude. There's nothing recorded about the Mithril Mines trip, boss."
There should be, Cisne broke in smoothly. At least a record of who went, and that it was done.
"Oh yeah, there's that," Renault complained, waving a hand at her. He kicked his legs back up onto the table, his boots wrinkling a nearby piece of paper, as he tipped back onto two chair legs again. "Gibbs Richards, soldier 3rd class, partnered with Edge Mueller, also 3rd class. Troopers Sparrow Kinley and Jack Howell from Squad 18. Connolly Wilhelm from Strife's old Squad 15. But you don't need a report to know that. None of them talked about the mission at all, and me and Rude dug deep for information. No boasting about a mission with Sephiroth, nothing. If that's not awfully strange, then I'll eat Rude's glasses." Next to him, Rude shot his partner a shocked look from behind said ever-present sunglasses. "A sign of loyalty to someone," Tsing said, frowning thoughtfully. "Cloud himself, or Zack, perhaps."
"Maybe it was like you said, Tsing. And it was an order from Sephiroth?"
Shotgun put in. "I'm not entirely sure," Tsing admitted slowly. Sephiroth was on the recent mission to Icicle as well, and he seemed distant at best. Kunzel fought the urge to shift in his hiding spot. This sounded much more serious than he'd initially thought, and unfortunately it looked like Zack's charge was at the center of it. The kid hadn't seemed to be all there in the head to him. It had been sort of cute watching him trail around after Zack like a lost chocobo. Now he was realizing he might have missed some very important signs by dismissing Cloud so much. Sure, he seemed to be a capable fighter. Kunzel couldn't say for sure if it was due to Zack's tutelage, or skill Cloud had had before his accident. But being good with the sword didn't predispose someone to being great at conspiracies, planning, or playing the information network. Question was Zack right in there with Cloud? Or was the kid pulling the wool over Zack's eyes, too? Who was he kidding? Zack had been party to strange conspiracies for over a year.
Zack does have a lot of sway among the soldiers, at least. He's taken over Hewley's place as most popular first. Not that he has much competition, Shotgun said as she leaned her elbows onto the table and rested her chin on her hands. Which was true enough. Sephiroth might be the hero that Shin represented to the people of Midgar and the rest of the world, but he was certainly a fearsome person, someone that many soldiers wanted to live up to and emulate. Zack was likable, and his words encouraged people. That just wasn't something Sephiroth seemed capable of. Zack was one of them. What worried Kunzel was that whatever trouble Cloud was part of, Zack was in it too. Zack was his friend,
and he hated having to worry about his friends getting in over their head. He also doubted either of them knew just how interested the Turks were in the situation, though with how unforthcoming Zack was being, he probably wasn't oblivious to the attention. For a moment, Kunzel hesitated. Sure, Zack was his friend, but this conspiracy looked like big trouble. If he continued to listen, continued to pal himself with Zack and inevitably Cloud, he could get caught up in the fallout. Really, though, there was no way Kunzel would abandon Zack like that. It wasn't in him to give up on a friend, even if the worst happened. His own curiosity insisted he learn as much as possible, and his integrity would have him protect anyone he could. It kinda hurt that Zack wasn't letting him in on whatever was happening, though. Kunzel supposed he'd just have to wait, and make sure Zack knew he could come to him if he needed help. Shotgun, you visited the Chocobo Ranch, correct? Tseng asked, making a few notes on the papers in front of him. She straightened quickly, as if she'd been reprimanded, and folded her hands in her lap.
Sir, there wasn't much to be learned about the Mithril Mines mission, as they only stopped there for an hour to collect the birds.
You know, if it wasn't for all the witnesses, I would doubt this mission ever really happened. Reno griped. Shotgun didn't move except to kick out of Reno's chair leg, which sent the redhead crashing to the floor in a flurry of curses.
I did learn something of interest, though it's not that important to the mystery around Cloud, she added apologetically to Tseng.
Reno flailed on the floor, and Kunzel bit back a curse when the Turk's head turned in the direction of the kitchen. His luck held as Reno didn't give the partially cracked door even a glance as he scrambled to his feet. Tseng nodded at her, and ignored the loud scraping as Reno righted his chair. Continue.
I've discovered the origin of Sephiroth's new pet, she said, grinning faintly. Apparently a local racer was staying at the ranch and attempting to breed a new bird. Unluckily for him, his latest egg hatched during the middle of the night. Apparently Sephiroth strode right into the barn when the guy went to check on the egg and, well, it saw Sephiroth first. Even though Kunzel was worried about Zack and Cloud, he very nearly rubbed his hands together in glee at that news. No one in the entire city knew more than Sephiroth had shown up one day with the black chick at his heels, and there had been absolutely no word of how it had been acquired. Sure, there was no way Kunzel could tell anyone about it, but he hated not knowing. Also, I couldn't confirm this, but the ranchers seemed to believe that one of the troopers in the group drove off the racer during a confrontation. By all accounts, it could very well have been Cloud. However, I could not find out the content of the altercation.
I hadn't expected much from that source, Tseng said with a nod. It is something else to keep in mind. My head's gonna explode with everything we have to keep in mind, Reno groused. What about you, boss? You said you got more information? Tseng didn't say anything right off. Instead, he took the time to write down a few more lines, then stacked the papers neatly in front of him. Kunzel waited patiently for him to finish stalling. However funny it was to watch Reno's impatient jittering. Finally, Tseng looked up at Shotgun. One more thing, if I may. You met Cloud on a mission, correct? We already know that! Reno burst out in frustration, throwing his hands into the air. She mentioned it during the first meeting. Rude looked flustered at Reno's side, head turned from Tseng's pinched expression to his partner. After a moment, he reached out a hand and shoved Reno backwards right out of his chair again, cutting short the redhead's protests. Kunzel bit down on his knuckle to keep from chuckling as Reno went down swearing again, though he was sure he saw an approving nod from Tseng. Who knew Turks could act like nothing so much as a group of rowdy teenagers? Shotgun nodded, absently pulling her ponytail over her shoulder.
That's right. It was our first encounter with the Ravens as well. What did you need to know that's not in the report?
It's relevant to the things that happened on my mission with Cloud, Tseng replied. Recall as best you can Cloud's actions and motives during his encounter with the Ravens. Shotgun hummed and closed her eyes in recollection.
Mostly, Cloud was intent on protecting Dr. Rayleigh. By any means and from anyone, including myself. She frowned, opening her eyes and looking questioningly at Tseng.
Wait a minute, Rano interrupted, raising a hand from below the table, waving it to get their attention. That doesn't make sense. I definitely saw him fight tooth and nail with Zack back in Junon, when it was even suggested he come anywhere near a doctor. And we know that report was a pile of shit. Now he's all buddy-buddy with one. Tseng pinched the bridge of his nose tiredly. Another contradiction, possibly. He was aware of Dr. Rayleigh's profession, I assume.
It was no secret,
Shotgun confirmed.
Could his issues with doctors have been brought on by his recent Mako bath?
Cisne asked softly.
Increased aggression and paranoia?
It's a known effect of Mako exposure. Saying aloud. Continue, Shotgun. How did Cloud interact with the ravens? She raised her eyebrows, but obediently continued on.
He was intent on fighting them, to the point that, despite his fever for her safety, he would leave Dr. Rayleigh behind to join me in combat. Initially I believed this was a desire to show off, or prove himself, but after his company was wiped out and the doctor put in danger, it seemed more personal, I guess. He was even able to wield one of the Raven's swords while injured, though he claimed it was desperation that drove him on. She shrugged. He was a good kid with his heart in the right place, but he was definitely inexperienced in combat.
Thank you, Shotgun. That clears up one item at least, Tseng said, dropping his eyes to the pages of a little black notebook he'd flipped open, and raised a million more questions in Kunzel's mind. Cloud was sounding more and more interesting by the second. At first, Kunzel had helped the kid out, as an unasked-for favor to Zack. Now, though, he was much more interested in seeking out Cloud himself, and seeing just what sort of guy he really was under that stoic expression. It also made him wonder about Cloud's apparent sword skill. Everyone knew about how the kid had taken on Sephiroth of Fort Condor. As much as Kunzel knew Zack was good, there was no way he'd be able to make a kid with little to no combat experience that good that fast. Plus this Raven thing the Turks kept mentioning. Kunzel had a hunch he'd be hearing about them again, and he already didn't like what he was learning. "And what's that, boss?" Rano asked, as he finally climbed back into his seat at the table. "I'm dying for some clarity here myself." Kunzel silently seconded that. Tseng lifted his gaze from the notebook calmly. Cloud Strife appears to be suffering from some form of memory loss. Reno let out a low whistle, and even Rude looked taken aback. Cisne frowned, but said nothing in response. Shotgun, however, had no such restraint.
That actually makes some sense, doesn't it?
She looked around the table, her ponytail swinging behind her.
I mean, when I met him again after the accident, he didn't really say anything to me at the time. But that doesn't really match his behavior from when I first met him. Mako is said to affect the mind. I observed him not long after the accident, and he was showing signs of confusion and a faulty sense of time,
Cisne said.
Combined with his psych report that declared his personality unfit for Mako treatment, perhaps we are seeing the results of that unfortunate combination.
Ouch. Kunzel winced in sympathy for the kid. If he'd already been turned down for soldier, especially because of a psychological reason, then his dip in Mako must have been hell. It was amazing he wasn't just a vegetable, really. And according to those reports, Reno mumbled, as he leaned over to fish through the stacks of papers, that stuff was raw and high-grade Mako. Okay, that was more than amazing. It was a miracle Cloud wasn't dead. Kunzel rubbed his forehead to wipe away a bit of sweat that had gathered, and leaned his head back against the wall. It was always thrilling to find out just how much he didn't know, and at the same time stirred in him a desire to know everything. Probably why he was such a Turk. Perhaps we should review some soldier medical reports and see how his symptoms measure up against the norm. Tseng concluded. Shuriken, I'm putting you in charge of that. Cisne nodded in acknowledgement, and after a moment he continued. The other connection to Shotgun's previous mission with Cloud is that there was a Raven attack this time as well. It is what brought to light his faulty memory. The reaction he had was too strange for normal trauma. Combined with other interactions, it was apparent that Cloud is unable to recall past meetings at will. The Raven triggered a recollection, yet Cloud's former squadmates did not. Hey, slow down, Tseng, Reno said with a pained expression. He held his hands up as if to physically put a stop to Tseng's words. Can you spell it out a little clearer for us lowly peons? Next to him, Rude nodded in agreement. Tseng closed his mouth on his next sentence and looked around the small circle of Turks. Even from here, Kunzel thought they all looked exhausted. My apologies, Tseng said, sitting back in his chair. It has been a stressful time for us all. He was quiet for a few breaths, then he began again. I was able to witness Cloud's interaction with his former teammates. On the surface, it would seem that his reactions and verbal exchange to his peers was fairly normal. He was, apparently, interfering with some minor bullying in regards to himself, and to a lesser extent, the trooper Connolly Wilhelm. However, the only time he directly engaged the others was after they approached him. During boarding, the trip over, and the short time before the attack, never once did Cloud show any regard to anyone except for Zack, Sephiroth, and Wilhelm. Even his former captain's attempts to make conversation were met with nothing. It is possible it was an attempt to throw me off, Tseng continued. It's hard to say, since we don't know how he interacted with his peers before. He expressed ignorance of who his former teammates were, and that was treated as a joke by all. I believe it may have been more of an involuntary truth, however, especially coupled with later examples. Kunzel frowned to himself. Was Zack aware of Cloud's memory problems? It was unlikely he wasn't, which was probably a big reason why he was being so closed-mouthed about the whole thing. Maybe Zack knew something no one else did that made him decide not to take Cloud to a doctor, the kid's protests aside. Or if the Turks were to be believed, falsified a doctor's report. Kunzel didn't see Zack allowing harm to come to Cloud, not with the way he mothered over him normally. Still, that must have been rough on the kid. No wonder he was clinging tightly to Zack's side.
Is it possible this is an ongoing problem? Cisne interjected quietly. Could he be unable to retain memories at all anymore?
Tseng shook his head. No, he made allusions to a past meeting with Wilhelm. However, he did say something strange in regards to it. What isn't strange about what comes out of that guy's mouth? Renault complained. I'd much rather shut it up permanently and be done with this mess. That'd be messier. Rude shot back. Renault groaned theatrically, letting his head thunk on the back of his chair. Ah, true. What's strange? Shotgun added, ignoring the byplay. Cloud said that Wilhelm held his own against Sephiroth. Tseng said blandly. The guy had a talent for dropping verbal bombs, without twitching a facial muscle, that Kunzel had to reluctantly admire. The proclamation hung there between the Turks, and prickled at Kunzel's skin like a physical thing. Okay, what? Renault demanded, slamming his hand down on the table in emphasis. One trooper holding their own against Sephiroth is enough. Now we apparently got two? When? How? What the hell, man? I haven't heard jack about this. Beside Renault, Rude's bald head shook in a negative. Kunzel felt his lips twitch in a grin, even as adrenaline shot through him. How deep and far-reaching was this? Who had it touched? And where was it going? Was it, he wondered, an extension of the mess with Angeal and Genesis? Or was this some whole other beast rearing its head? He made a mental note of the name Wilhelm, leaning eagerly forward to hear more. I suspect it was exaggeration, Tseng said calmly, though he did massage the bridge of his nose briefly. As I said, Cloud was defending himself and Wilhelm against the bullying of their peers. I am unsure to what event he was referring to. It could have been something that happened during the time we can't account for. Reno flopped back in his chair and ran a hand down his face. This Wilhelm guy was one of the ones on that mysterious Mithril Mines mission, he drawled. As well as Modierheim, Tseng added dryly, which was the mission I first met Cloud on. I can contest to Shotgun's account that there has been a major personality shift from before and after the accident. Tseng rattled his fingers against the table as he thought. Wilhelm returned to our downed helicopter partway through that mission and managed to radio back to base. However, I have reason to believe he is covering for Cloud on a more personal level.
Would you like me to look into his records as well? Cisne asked. And the others that were involved in that mission?
No, Tseng said. He clasped his hands atop the table and frowned down at them for a moment. With our continued search for Avalanche's internal source of information, we're coming under too much strain. It may be advisable to bring in another hand if we're to continue this line of investigation. He looked up at Cisne, dark eyes serious. Who would you trust to help you? Cisne was quiet for a moment, her head turned to look thoughtfully out a nearby window.
Katana, she said at last. We've worked together a number of times, and he has a good personality for it.
Very well, Tseng said with a nod. I will inform him later, so long as it does not interfere with his normal duties. Veld has allowed our investigation unofficially, so we cannot fail in our other tasks. You'll have to fill him in on the particulars.
Understood.
Wilhelm's loyalty for Cloud isn't straightforward, however. Tseng continued, as if the aside hadn't happened. While he is unwilling to share his knowledge in public, he is willing to risk Cloud's ire and concern for his well-being. In other words, Blondie has another mother hen, Reno piped up. Or another If you go on about his love life again, Reno, I will make you my game next hunt. Shotgun snapped, wrinkling her nose at the redhead. I just want to finish up and go to bed. All right, Reno griped. No need to bite my head off. Tseng. The word came from the very present, but ever quiet Rude. You mentioned a strong reaction to the Raven. There was that word again. It was probably some Turk code, or at least something too classified for the general army to gossip about. That meant dangerous. It also meant that Kunzel now had some priceless information. Tseng nodded. Correct. During the initial attack from the Raven, Cloud showed a reluctance to commit to a fight. At first, I believed this to be a conscious decision. The Raven was more enhanced than the ones described in your report, Shotgun. However, Cloud collapsed at one point, and I believe he suffered from a recollection of his previous encounter. After he recovered his senses, he subdued the Raven easily and without hesitation. That sounded like more contradicting information about Cloud's combat ability to Kunzel. The kid could face down Sephiroth without flinching, but shied away from whatever this Raven was. Not to mention enhancements. That sounded like some sort of rogue soldier. But as far as Kunzel knew, there hadn't been any desertions lately. Not since Genesis. And for all he'd gone off the deep end, Genesis hadn't allied himself with Avalanche. Not that Kunzel had heard.
Was the Raven one of the changed soldiers?
Cisne asked, frowning and tapping a finger against her leg.
Or is this a new type?
Well, shit. He definitely hadn't heard about changed soldiers. The Raven appeared to be like the ones we faced before, Tseng said. But its combat abilities seem to have been enhanced again. This Raven is currently enjoying a stay with the science department. All sorts of alarm bells went off in Kunzel's mind at that. Whatever these Ravens were sounded like bad news, up to and including his fellow soldiers. Who knew what the science department would get up to, with such a curiosity on hand? And if Ravens were made, whatever that meant, from soldiers, He made a mental note to keep his eye out for any new programs that came from that section of Shinra. At least he could warn people away from volunteering. Shotgun stretched, arms reaching for the ceiling as she squeezed her eyes shut. When she relaxed again, she nodded at Tseng.
Sounds like you had a rough time. Was there anything else we need to know right now?
Unfortunately, yes. Tseng acknowledged her groan of discontent with a dry smile. But not much more. The only other thing of note was the interactions between Sephiroth, Zack, and Cloud. I thought you said Sephiroth was distant, Reno pointed out. He leaned back on two chair legs again and was rocking back and forth gently. Doesn't seem like there's been a lot of interaction going on there. He was distant in all matters concerning Cloud's oddity, if not disinterested, Tseng admitted. However, the interaction between the three has revealed some disconcerting parallels. He went quiet, the pause stretching on as he seemed to gather his thoughts. Other than Zack's audacity, they remind me far too much of our previous group of firsts. Reno stepped forward, his chair clattering loudly against the tiles. Hey, Strife's not a first yet, right? He may as well be, Tseng responded. We all know the president is eager to see him succeed.
Will he be promoted right away? Or will there be a pretense of rising in the ranks?
Cisne asked. With Lazard at the helm of the soldier program, there will be an attempt at fairness, Tseng said. However, how long will he be in charge? Reno asked rhetorically. Resentment settled in the pit of his stomach at that announcement. Lazard was a fair leader, and had run the soldier program with grace and integrity. Kunzel was all too aware that Heidegger was the likely replacement in the Shinra protocol hierarchy, and that would prove disastrous to the program, and more importantly to the people in the program. He definitely didn't like where things were heading. It might be time to look into a discreet retirement for himself and those who shared his opinions. Tseng tapped his paper before him and cleared his throat. Regardless, we know that Cloud and Sephiroth appear to have begun some sort of rivalry, while Zack is a mitigating factor to the both of them. When put that way, Tseng was right. The dynamic was hauntingly familiar. Genesis Rhapsodus and Angel Hewley had turned out to be bad news, as much as they'd been admired. Kunzel hated to think of Zack falling to a similar fate.
That could be a good thing, couldn't it? Shotgun asked. Weren't those three close friends before Rhapsodus deserted? Which was the cause of Hewley's desertion, Cisne pointed out. We've been keeping an eye on Zack ever since. There's been worry that he'll decide to start blaming his mentor's death on Shinra, and desert as well. It's the same for Sephiroth. Close ties breed weaknesses in company loyalty.
Kunzel let the door slide quietly shut and closed his eyes. He could still hear their voices, but it was almost too much to continue listening to them over the pounding of his heart. How long had they been watching Zack? Since Angel had left? Since he died? And they're both drawn to Cloud. Rude broke in again. A possible point of dissent. And now we're right back where we started, Myrna groaned. We have no idea what anyone's motives are, or if there are motives, or if anyone is actually planning anything. For a group that includes Fair, they sure are a quiet bunch. We'll simply have to continue watching them carefully, Tseng said, finality in his voice. We can't afford to let a repeat of Genesis and Angel happen. There was the sound of scuffling and the scraping of chair legs as the Turks rose. Kunzel contemplated being worried they would come check the kitchen before they left, but couldn't summon up the energy. He wondered if this was how Zack had felt when Angel had disappeared, like the entire world was spiraling out of control. Luckily, the Turks were confident in their solitude and exited the cafeteria without dawdling. Kunzel could hear Reno's loud voice echoing through the room before the door swung shut behind him. He brought his hands up, staring unseeingly at them as he tried to get his thoughts under control. What had started out as a bout of good-natured eavesdropping seemed to have been a proverbial jumping hole. Kunzel prided himself in knowing what was going on in the company, from the lowliest trooper to the highest officer.
He knew there was more going on than he'd been able to figure out, but now he realized just how woefully ignorant of the real issues happening in the company he was. He'd heard hints before, snippets of rumors, yet he hadn't been able to put any more of the pieces together. Stumbling upon this Turk meeting was both a boon and a curse. There was no way he could leave things be when his friends were at the center of a conspiracy. Not to mention him even knowing any of this information was a death warrant if he was ever found out. Where to go from here? First, he needed to find out as much as he could about the names mentioned by the Turks, starting with the one that sounded the most intriguing, this Wilhelm fella. He'd need to find some of the other information-savvy soldiers as well, see if they had any further bits of information that he could now make sense of. Any information he could glean about these ravens would be valuable in keeping his skin safe, if they were Avalanche's answer to Soldier. The sound of the cafeteria doors opening stirred Kunzel from his muddled thoughts. A loud voice echoed through the room, and he was relieved to note that it wasn't one of the Turks returning.
Hey, where is everyone?
Pushing himself to his feet, he stepped through the doors that connected the kitchen to the main room. In the center of the cafeteria, a second stood, with his hands on his hips, helmet dragging from one hand. He recognized the man as Luxier, another of Zach's friends, and a fellow information gatherer. How ironic. More of Kunzel's luck at work? He could start right away, at least, feeling him out as a possible ally.
Hey, Luxier. They're all off on an enforced break, I imagine. I just saw a bunch of Turks leave a minute ago, he said, nodding in greeting.
Luxier turned to face him, and his forehead wrinkled in a frown.
Do I know you?
He asked, bafflement thick in his voice. Kunzel froze, as he finally remembered he'd taken off his helmet earlier. It felt like a lifetime ago. To fix the microwave. His tendency to wear the headgear at all times was infamous. It had sprung from his dislike of the freckles he gained from prolonged exposure to sunlight, and he'd just let the legend grow. Oh well, it was too late now for regrets.
One moment,
Kunzel said, and ducked back into the kitchen. His helmet was still on the counter, where he'd left it, and he quickly scooped it up and put it on. When he stepped back out, Luxier's face lit up with recognition.
Oh, hey, Kunzel. Hey! Wait, take it off again! I had no idea that was you!
Luxier's expression was collapsed in disappointment, and Kunzel allowed an amused chuckle.
Maybe if you give me a hand in here,
he said, waving the other second to follow him. No reason not to finish what he started, after all. Luxier looked confused, but followed gamely. Is the microwave working yet? He asked. I know some guys decided to stick a bolt plume in there earlier, so I took off before it got too bad.
Not yet, but I'm trying to get it working. Want to give me a hand? I heard you're pretty good with the Shinra Gossip Network.
He could always do with another source, after all.
The only real sound was that of the engine of the truck they were riding in, and the wind rushing past Cloud's ears. The same wind ruffled his hair, tugging at it wildly, just as it did Zach's. Zach, who was stretched out and taking up far more space in the bed of the truck they were in than was strictly necessary. His friend was sprawled out near the back of the cab, elbows resting on the rim of the wall, and his head thrown back. He decided to stretch his legs all the way across the bed of the truck, and there wasn't that much space between them, their two swords, and Veery crouched happily at Cloud's side, with his head up in the air. The chocobo looked much the same as Zack did, with his developing crest blowing every which way in the wind. The sunlight glinted off the black's brand-new collar as he gave a happy chuckle of delight, wide, bright eyes observing the passing landscape. Cloud was still mystified by what Sephiroth hoped to achieve by equipping the bird with a collar that had materia slots in it. It was weird enough Sephiroth had approached them to, basically, babysit for him. It had been as they were leaving the Shinra building that Sephiroth had shown up with Veery in tow. He hadn't given much explanation, only saying,
I am required at a board meeting, and Veery isn't allowed. The last time I was in one, he attempted to eat Scarlet's dress.
Zack's snort of laughter had garnered a glare from the man, and Sephiroth had said flatly,
Though it was amusing, I am unwilling to endure another hour of Scarlet's shrill screams.
With the chocobo cuddling blissfully into his side, Cloud wondered vaguely what exactly Sephiroth was teaching the bird. Somewhat inevitably, he found his gaze drawn back to Zack's face. It was obvious by the wide grin and closed eyes that Zack was enjoying himself. Not that it was surprising. After all, Zack had practically tackled him this morning, enthusiastically asking,
Hey, Cloud, you want to get out of Midgar for a while? Come on, what do you say? It looks like it's going to be a beautiful day.
It left Cloud with an unfamiliar feeling of butterflies, though it wasn't due to nerves. If anything, the truck ride should have been affecting him more than it was. It was so much like that momentary, lucid memory of another time, of green-tinted visions of another Zack. As soon as Cloud had seen what Zack had found for their ride, he'd expected the wave of hurt and memories to crash over him. It hadn't come, and he doubted the trigger for the memory hinged on the fact that this pickup truck wasn't yellow like the one he remembered so vividly. Cloud wasn't sure if it was as Aerith had said, that he was finally letting go and moving on or not. Surfacing briefly from his thoughts, he realized he was still staring at Zack's face. He tore his gaze away and forced himself to focus on the blurring landscape. At least he had plenty of practice with that, thanks to the long hours he'd spent on Finir, driving past this same terrain. Riding in the truck was different. It was less immediate, more detached, since he was at the mercy of another driver, and he found he missed his bike and the smooth responsiveness it had to his whims. Driving hadn't been at the top of his list of worries since his arrival. He'd been too caught up in his daily life with Zack, the looming threat of Shinra, and everything in between, to even spare a thought for his lost profession. When he'd first arrived in this time, it had been such a rush of confusion, with every spare moment used to fit in and make sure he was not drawing attention to his strangeness, to remain unnoticed in Shinra's closely watched system. As the months passed and Cloud adapted, all that had become, less important. It didn't matter that the Turks were lurking around, their intelligent eyes weighing him against their own objectives. It didn't matter if a few troopers thought it strange that a nobody had become a somebody overnight, so long as all they had was suspicions. What they thought was inconsequential. What was important was Zack waking him up in the morning with breakfast in hand and a day planned full. On Aerith's gleeful laughter as Cloud tripped over himself trying to keep their slum girl helpers from overwatering a new batch of seedlings in their enthusiasm. Even the rare evenings when Gibbs and Edge would steal him away from Zack, a task they were very smug about, though Cloud couldn't fathom why, oftentimes accompanied by one or more of their troopers, were enjoyable. He hadn't forgotten what the future could bring. How could he? The threat of Nibelheim and all it meant still loomed in the back of his mind. There were still wounds in his heart of the pain and terror he'd experienced. Though the people hadn't yet caused him that grief, there was still the potential for them to do so. But there was also the overridingly strong feelings of hope and joy his friends had given him. Time and time again, that still kept him buoyed up. Those memories anchored him and kept things in perspective. Even so, when he thought of how terrible the future could be compared against the new memories he'd built, of the Sephiroth he'd come to know, the one who tolerated Zack's enthusiastic attempts at friendship, the one who was quietly amused at Fury's antics, the one who respected Cloud's strength. In the face of all of that, it seemed impossible for such a threat to exist. It was a while of just feeling the truck bump and sway underneath him that Cloud noticed his gaze had returned to Zack's face. It was only after he realized he was looking blankly at the way his friend's eyelashes made a dark shadow on his cheeks that Cloud knew he was staring again. That was happening more and more, much to his consternation. He quickly focused his gaze on his boots and tried to will his attention where it belonged. All he needed was for his pale skin to show the embarrassed flush that was creeping up his neck. He wasn't quite sure when this new fascination had started, but recently when his mind wandered, he found himself unconsciously observing Zack. Zack hadn't seemed to notice, which made him wonder if he'd been staring all along and was only now becoming aware of it. Whatever the reason, it was beginning to fluster Cloud at all the wrong moments. Times when Zack would throw a companionable arm around his shoulders were spent hyper-aware of the heat his friend gave off. It didn't help that Zack was very tactile. Sighing, he tried to push thoughts of Zack aside. It wasn't easy, and he couldn't repress the twinge of mortification from spacing again as he recalled what had caused this recent bout of fascination. Cloud wasn't completely unfamiliar with sexual nighttime dreams. The few he'd had when he was younger, before the guilt had stolen his dreams away, had only featured the two women in his life he'd wanted to love like that. Waking, he'd always felt vaguely uncomfortable and ashamed after those nights. They'd been on an important mission to save the world from one threat or another, and such things seemed petty and unfair to his companions. After Aerith's death, they'd stopped entirely. Until a few days ago. Cloud had woken up more confused than anything, in a sweaty tangle of limbs and sheets, and a burning feeling of embarrassment. Dreams of Aerith were rare, and that would have been enough for him to feel the bite of shame for dreaming about what was not only his own friend, but Zack's girlfriend as well. Except that Cloud could remember all too well the second set of hands, larger than Aerith's, but much more familiar, that had featured in his dream. He hadn't been able to look Zack in the face all morning, too confused and embarrassed over the images of his friend that his mind had provided him with. If he was being honest, Cloud would admit he was obtusely awkward about matters of the heart. It wasn't as if he had much experience. The abortive date with Aerith was one such example, and he hadn't been in his right mind at the time. Another was the rather confusing instance of his first kiss. He couldn't remember the exact point it had been during their journey, just that he'd been sitting next to Tifa, listening to her talk, and the next minute Yuffie had sidled up to his side. Without warning, the young ninja had hauled him down and mashed her mouth against his. Cloud had frozen, baffled and uncomfortably aware of Tifa's loud protest beside him. Once he was released, all Yuffie had to say before she scampered off was,
"Ha! For someone everyone's fighting over, you're a sucky kisser."
The comment had made little sense then, though in retrospect it was probably in reference to his indecisive affection for Aerith and Tifa. He'd been so focused on Sephiroth and chasing the madman down that by the time Cloud had realized he'd been presented with a choice, it had been too late. Aerith was dead in his arms, and everything else became insignificant compared to finishing Sephiroth off. After that, it had been regret and horror and trying to piece himself back together. Then his attempts to form some kind of family with Tifa had been destroyed by the onset of geostigma and the renewal of his guilt. Sometimes it still felt like he'd failed her, in that he'd never been able to give her the relationship she'd tentatively continued to hope for. This almost felt like being in that situation again, only Cloud was more aware of it, almost hyperactively so. He'd asked himself over and over if he somehow wanted Zack and Aerith to separate, either to rekindle his own feelings for her, or possibly start something with Zack. The number of people Cloud had been interested in his life could be counted as 2, and neither of them had been male. It wasn't something he'd considered before, but he couldn't deny that Zack's warm and giving nature and the amount of time they spent together wasn't having an effect on him. In the end, though, Cloud had concluded that he honestly was happy with his friend's relationship. He had no desire to break that up, or even interfere in any way. Yet he was drawn to Zack all the same, which left him in this somewhat uncomfortable state of staring at his friend at any given moment, which he was doing again. Digging one hand into Viri's feathers, Cloud wondered if he still knew where his helmet was. At least that way his bad habit wouldn't be so obvious.
Hey, where'd you say you wanted off?
The voice of the driver hollered, startling Cloud out of his dour thoughts. Zack immediately sat up with a slight jerk.
Here's fine.
He yelled back and smacked his palms against the back of the cab. The truck rolled over to the side of the road and coasted to a halt, still vibrating as the engine continued to rumble. Cloud pulled himself to his feet, glad to finally be able to get up and stretch his legs. He gripped his pant leg and gave it a little shake in an effort to get rid of some of the dust that he picked up from the pickup's bed. Viri gave a questioning chirp.
You sure?
The driver asked.
Car's still a couple miles out.
Zack rolled onto his knees and leaned around the cab to address him, one hand gripping the roof to steady himself.
Yeah, we have a bit of work to do out here first. Thanks for the ride, man. It was no problem.
Viri lurched to his feet, staggering slightly on the uneven floor of the bed, and Cloud reached up to steady him. The bird warbled happily and butted his beak against Cloud's chest, begging for pets. He obligingly dug his fingers into the thick ruff of feathers forming around the base of his neck. With one of his easy, infectious laughs, Zack vaulted over the side of the truck and landed nimbly on the ground. After straightening, he strode around and yanked the tailgate down with a faint, metallic clunk. Viri cheerfully sidled over to the edge and hopped down. Zack grinned, reaching over to ruffle the bird's crest, much like he often did to Cloud's hair.
Whatever else can be said for you, Fuzzy,
he said.
Sephiroth sure has trained you well.
Viri gave an enthusiastic walk and turned to explore their new surroundings with a keen eye, while Zack reached over and hauled Buster Sword back up. With a quick twirl, he set the blade on his back and turned his gaze on Cloud. Cloud crouched down to grab his own sword and set it into its harness with much less fanfare. When he looked up, Zack had leaned one arm on the tailgate and propped his other fist on his hip.
Well, you coming or not?
Yeah, Cloud said simply. He walked to the edge of the truck bed and jumped down. Behind him, it gave another metallic creak as Zack heaved it closed again, then banged his fist against it to signal they were clear. Cloud turned to watch as the truck pulled out into the road again and roared off. Beside him, Zack clapped his hands, the leather rasping as he rubbed them together, and turned on his heel.
Oh yeah, let's get this done. I told you it was going to be a beautiful day.
Cloud grinned at Zack's exuberance and ducked his chin to hide it behind his scarf. It was always nice to see Zack so happy and carefree. Despite Zack's optimistic personality, Cloud had come to learn that he wasn't as made of energy as he seemed. It was rare that Zack got quite this excited, though.
Do you know where we're going?
He asked bemusedly.
This way!
Zack shot back. Privately, he thought Zack had just picked a direction at random. It wouldn't surprise him at all if Zack had forgotten what their destination was in his eagerness. Zack turned on his heel and marched confidently off, and with an exultant walk, Veery charged after him, Cloud following the two. Zack was right about the weather. The breeze was just enough to cool the air, and the temperature was just high enough to be considered comfortably warm. Out here, away from the frenetic energy of the people, and surrounded by rocky hills and rolling green grass, it was calm and quiet in a way Cloud was only beginning to realize he'd missed. Around them, there was nothing but the occasional tree and shrub crouched here and there among the rocky clusters that stuck up against a vivid blue horizon. All in all, it was a nice day to be out of Midgar, and he was glad to get away from the claustrophobia of the city. The only sounds were the whisper of the breeze, Veery's happy call as he explored the uneven terrain, and the crunch of Zack in his boots against the rock-strewn ground. Cloud let himself bask in the warm sunlight and fresh air. After a short distance, Zack slowed his pace and fell into step with Cloud. They'd only gone a bit further when there was a sudden beep that Cloud had come to know well. Beside him, Zack stopped walking and pulled his phone out of his pocket and flipped it open all in the same motion.
What the?
Cloud looked over at Zack's baffled words and found himself studying the slope of Zack's jaw and the way his dark hair fell forward around his neck. As Zack examined his phone, he looked away, flustered and guilty for his inadvertent fascination. Once he'd mastered his expression, Cloud looked back at Zack.
Zack? Is there a problem? I don't think so.
Zack said. He looked up at Cloud, a frown in place of his usual smile.
It's just a weird mail from Kunzel. All it says is, you know, if you're in trouble you can count on me, right? I wonder if something's going on.
Zack shrugged, then brightened.
Maybe he had a few too many drinks and got all sentimental. There was this one time he went and saw Loveless and...
Maybe he knows something about this mission that we don't.
Cloud pointed out. While he hadn't been about to object to getting out of Midgar for a change, there had been no reason for Zack to volunteer them for this trip. It was simple enough for a single third to take care of. Clear out a pack of calmfangs that had been lurking too close to the town and harrying the outlying residences. The underlying reason could have been as simple as Zack wanting to get out of the city for a while, but something about his friend's excessive energy spoke of nervousness. Not much, but it was there. Almost immediately, an expression of sheepish guilt overcame Zack's face, and he offered,
Heh, maybe.
Bingo. Well, if Zack was acting guilty rather than serious, then whatever it was probably wasn't anything to worry about. Nonetheless, Cloud crossed his arms and stared pointedly at Zack, waiting patiently for his conscience to compel him to spill. Zack looked away first, eyes tracking idly over their surroundings as he began to babble.
I mean, hey, it's Kunzel. He always knows something is up. He seems to know everything that goes on. Except about you. I'm the only one that knows about that. Which is cool. It's nice to have one up on the... Zach, you're rambling.
He didn't let his amusement show on his face. It wouldn't help get Zach to the point if he gave his friend any leeway now, no matter how endearing his babbling was. He mentally ground his own warm flush of admiration at that trait under a metaphorical heel. Zach's gaze jerked back to him, and he grinned again. He looked like a puppy that had been caught with his owner's shoe in his teeth.
Am I? I didn't notice. Does this mean I should expect Sephiroth to be at some undetermined rendezvous or something?
Cloud scratched the back of his head in idle confusion. For as dodgy as Zach was being, that was the only thing he could think of at this point. He didn't let himself dwell on how little the idea bothered him.
What? No!
Zach yelped.
I wouldn't spring him on you, you know that. Besides, Sephiroth's got that meeting of his, and that was the first time I saw him today. Then why are you being so evasive? That's usually my job.
Zach shot him a pained look, then groaned and wandered away a few steps to sit down on a nearby rock. Veery tripped over and immediately began demanding pets, which Zach obliged.
It's kind of embarrassing,
his friend admitted.
You see, there's this girl, and I kind of made her cry.
Cloud felt his eyebrows raise in surprise, even as his mouth pulled down in a real frown.
I thought you were happy with Aerith.
Maybe it was his own mixed feelings that were coloring his perception. But for as outgoing as Zach was, he had always been loyal to Aerith's affections. Zach jerked up, wide-eyed, and waved his hands frantically through the air. Veery jerked away in startlement, with a loud walk.
No, it's nothing like that.
Unsurprisingly, he'd misinterpreted the situation again.
Well, then what's the problem?
He was completely out of his depths at this point. If Zach didn't clarify things, he was going to really stick his foot in it.
She's this little kid, all right? Like, I don't know, maybe 8 years old?
Zach's expression turned more hangdog by the second, and he held his phone up.
Somehow she has my email address and keeps sending me these messages. She's always in monster-infested areas. Well, the first one led me to the Chocobo Ranch, and that was a long while ago. But anyway, I kind of forgot about her, and I might be a bit worried about the brat. But the point is, I got a message from her earlier today.
Zach shrugged and flipped his phone back open, messed with it a minute, then held it out to Cloud. He took it slowly. That sort of reminded him of how Denzel had found Tifa in him. He shook off the momentary feeling of regret and possibly loneliness as he glanced down at the message displayed on the small screen. Subject, challenge, sender, treasure princess.
Geez, I hear all these anonymous sources sending you all kinds of really good tips, and you're not even following up on them. What kind of treasure hunter are you? Anyway, I thought I'd contact you again with a new challenge. You better live up to it, bucko, or I might just have to stop contacting you again. There are some interesting rumors about buried treasure around Calm. I bet I can find it before you do. You're not gonna let me beat you at a challenge, are you? No, I don't think so. Just try and get that treasure before me. Good luck!
After reading it over a second time, Cloud flipped the phone closed and tossed it back to Zach.
Do you have any idea where the treasure is?
He sort of doubted it, but he never knew with Zach. Zach pocketed his phone with a groan, then dropped his head into his hands. Veery crept back over and began to industriously try to groom his hair, though Zach didn't react.
I have no idea,
he admitted.
I'm not even really looking for the treasure. It probably doesn't even exist.
Letting out a quiet huff, Cloud shook his head and closed his eyes. He could recall the terrain around Calm easily, having spent many of his days traveling between it and Edge City in his role as delivery boy. There was one spot in particular that Yuffie had once pointed out to him on the map, which she said was a prime spot for hidden treasure. He wasn't sure if she'd been telling the truth, but it was as good a place to start as any, and wasn't too far from where they were. It was, however, practically in the opposite direction Zack had been heading.
If it exists, it's probably a few miles that way,
he said, opening his eyes and pointing into the distance.
There's a small stand of trees at the end of a rocky gorge, isolated.
Best lead we've got,
Zack said as he pushed Viri's beak away.
Stop that, bird breath. I mostly just want to find the kid and make sure she's not in any trouble.
Just remember we still have a mission to complete,
Cloud said humorously. It wouldn't be the first or the last time Zack forgot they were on an official job. Zack gave him a wide, easy grin and waved Cloud's reminder aside with a lazy gesture.
Yeah. What's a few calm fangs to us, though?
Then he stood up and dusted off his pants, before nodding in the direction they had to go.
Guess we're in for a bit of a run?
A rare feeling of mischief welled up in Cloud. Surely Sephiroth, being the perfectionist Cloud was coming to realize he was, would have already taught Viri basic commands. Clicking his tongue, he immediately had Viri's undivided attention as he gestured at Zack.
Tackle.
His friend only had a moment to look affronted before he was bowled onto his back by the full weight of the growing bird, who warbled happily at the new game. Cloud chuckled before taking off at a quick clip to get away from Zack's inevitable retaliation.
I can see you're taking Sephiroth's training to heart. Viri, off! Cloud!
Once his laughter died into a mere grin, Cloud let out a whistle, not breaking his stride. There was a distant, answering walk, and when he looked back, he could see the black swiftly catching up to him. Zack was still climbing back to his feet beyond. When Viri was level, the bird slowed down, chuckling happily when Cloud gave him an approving scratch. It didn't take long for Zack to catch up after that. Cloud wasn't really trying to keep out of reach, though he did have to duck nimbly out of the way when Zack took a playful swat at him. The gorge was more of a ditch that slowly widened and got deeper the further it ran, cutting into the meshing of grass and dry rock ground. In itself, it was mostly made of pale-coloured stone, sticking up all over as it wound along like some ancient, dry stream bed. It hadn't taken them long to reach the area, and now Zack gave the place a frown, hands on his hips.
I hope she's not down there,
he said after a moment.
It looks like the perfect place for monster ambushes.
Cloud silently agreed. The rocks stuck up in such a way that meant visibility wouldn't be great. There would be plenty of places for whatever monsters haunted the area to hide in. Zack strode forward, waving for Cloud to follow.
Come on, we need to check carefully. She likes to hide.
And wasn't this the perfect place for it? Cloud had to resist the urge to sigh out loud, far too aware at how immature that would make him look. His recent reminder of his physical age still bothered him. Some mornings he seriously contemplated just laying in bed until his joints stopped screaming at him, and only the knowledge that Zack could and would physically oust him from his bed got him moving. That was happening less and less, both the pain and Zack manhandling him out of bed. However, it didn't help that everything he did was a reminder that he was technically a hormonal teenager. They began a methodical search of the area, combing back and forth while moving forward to ensure no small form was crouched behind any of the large boulders that dotted the floor of the ravine. Viri disappeared ahead to explore, and Cloud allowed it, if only because it was Sephiroth's bird. That, and Viri kept popping his head back around the corners to reassure himself that Zack and Cloud were still following. He smiled slightly at the ridiculous display. His mind wandered to the current task. He wondered about a child being confident enough to brave the wilds on her own. Honestly, he doubted it was one of the slum kids from Midgar, thanks to the fence around the city. The residents had grown afraid of the outside world. Shinra ensured they were kept cowed under the heel of the corporation. That was one reason the slums were still so packed, even when there was the cleaner option of calm, close enough to travel to, and only a minimal danger of monster attacks. By the same token, however, he had a hard time imagining one of the relaxed, calm children being mischievous enough to cause Zack so much headache. The mystery of it itched at him, keeping him occupied as they moved deeper into the shaded canyon. Distracted as he was, the part of Cloud that was still hyper-aware of Zack noticed when the silence began to grate on him. His gaze would dart back to Cloud more and more often, a sure sign of his restlessness. So Cloud wasn't as surprised as he might have been when Zack finally cracked and spoke.
Look, I wanted to ask about, the whole...
Zack paused, gesticulating broadly at the scrub bushes around them.
Sephiroth thing.
He'd slowed his pace, no longer weaving back and forth in a search, and Cloud fell into step automatically.
I remember you saying that you beat him more than once.
He came to an abrupt halt, turning to look at Cloud. Cloud stopped more slowly, surprised at the sudden topic. This wasn't going to be a simple conversation about his bumbling attempts at interaction with the current Sephiroth, but...
Oh,
he said softly. Maybe he should have expected it. Running his hand through his hair, Zack heaved a sigh before pacing over to the nearest craggy wall. He turned and leaned back against it, jerking his head for Cloud to join him. Cloud could hear Buster's sword jostle against Zack's shoulder armor and the stone as he crossed his arms over his chest. Trying not to drag his feet, Cloud shuffled over and mirrored his pose, crossing his arms and feeling more like he was trying to stop the tight pinch in his chest than to appear relaxed.
I guess, yeah, we do need to talk about him,
he said, glad when his voice came out steady. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk about it. Okay, no, that was a lie. He really didn't want to talk about it. But Zack needed to know, deserved to know, after all he put up with, on faith at Cloud's word. It was just frustrating that even now, after all he'd learned about the man, that the monster still caused him this much distress. He wouldn't let it get to him, though. Not anymore. He wouldn't let it become a reality.
Yeah,
Zack said in a gust of breath. He looked sideways at Cloud, a guilty smile in place.
I don't mean to bring up bad memories, but we should get this squared away.
I know, Cloud agreed. Sephiroth, the other, was the central issue on what could go wrong. Nibelheim was an inevitability. It had to be. It was when they knew Jenova would be available, when they were isolated enough that it was feasible to slip someone as high profile as Sephiroth out of their control, he hoped. They couldn't risk Sephiroth falling under another influence. Jenova, Hojo, it didn't matter. When they weren't prepared for it. As much as you could prepare for it. One of the reasons the other Zack had failed was because he had been caught unaware. Hadn't known just how far Sephiroth would go. How far gone he already was. And how far was that even now? Did he really know? that the Sephiroth of now was sane, wasn't hiding the burning madness that had consumed his world. So Cloud needed to share his knowledge. Zack was already so much more prepared than he had been. Their training against the simulation was paying off, both in raising Zack's skill level and making sure he wouldn't freeze up when, if, it came down to fighting against the real thing. And maybe there was a small part of Cloud that wanted his friend to know, to understand how terrible the future could be if they made a mistake. Taking a breath, Cloud leaned his head back and regarded the strip of deep blue sky he could see above the rugged cliffs. It was strange, in a way, that the vast expanse was grounding to him, but he could remember the cool kiss of Aerith's rain on his face, and he drew strength from her memory.
Sephiroth, the other, as I remember him, was already gone, I think.
He paused, lips thinning as he forced himself to think back as early as he could, back to before Nibelheim had burned.
I don't really remember much before, but he was distant, aloof, even on arriving in Nibelheim.
Between the gut-wrenching terror and humiliation at someone from his hometown, Tifa, recognizing who he was and the failure he'd returned as, he did remember how Sephiroth had been so lifeless. He'd barely spoken a word to Zack in the truck, despite Zack's attempt to engage them all in conversation, and even when they'd been attacked by one of Nibel's fierce dragons, Sephiroth had slaughtered it dispassionately. While Sephiroth wasn't prone to wearing his expressions openly, Cloud could recognize now that small signs, like a twitch of the man's lips or a brief glance, were indications of some emotion. Back then there had been nothing. It had, he remembered nauseously, impressed him that Sephiroth was so controlled.
I know,
he said, blinking to clear his head of the memories.
This is roundabout, but you should hear it all to understand.
It came out as a question, as he was unsure if he was being clear or misinterpreting Zack's intentions entirely. Zack gave a laugh that was a little rough, a little stilted, but his face showed an open humor, as it always did. He lifted the fingers of one hand from his bicep in a familiar, dismissive gesture.
Take all the time you need. I'll do my best to hold my questions back until the right time.
Cloud's lips pulled into a smile. No real humor behind it, but appreciative of Zack's effort. It was hard enough, they both knew, and it didn't help that Zack's gesture reminded him so much of the other Zack's final, forgiving farewell. Cloud tried to banish the comparison in deference to his friend of now, but it lingered in the back of his mind.
You know I don't remember much before Nibelheim, so I can't say what led up to it. Even if I did remember.
He paused, reaching a hand up to brush at his forehead in remembered pain.
I don't think I would have known enough to tell what was going on with Sephiroth. I never made it into Soldier, and I doubt my squad went on many, if any, missions with him. So this may be a little biased.
He grinned faintly at Zack's quiet snort of amusement.
Yeah, well...
Their stopping spot was still heavily shaded, the walls high, and the sun at the wrong angle to shine directly down. Gathering his thoughts, he stared blankly at the border of the sunlight on the cliff above them.
Nibelheim is a trap. I don't know how he was so sure it would work, but Hojo set it up. There's a library hidden in the old Shinra mansion.
where he'd left old research notes from a scientist named Gast. I never read what was in them, but Sephiroth told me. Told the other Zack some of it. We later found out the information was wrong. False research, modified texts, outdated material, biased in a way to make Sephiroth appear inhuman. All for him to find. Sephiroth, well, of course he went looking. He's always researching, Cloud muttered. But that place doesn't have the right answers for him. It's not the truth. The notes all tell of Jenova, how she was an ancient, and of the promised land, how Sephiroth was her son. He spat the words bitterly. He hadn't been there himself. No, that was the other Zack's role in this story. But it felt like he had. So vivid were the stolen memories. The other Zack must have related the story to him at some point. Probably just for lack of other things to say when Cloud was unresponsive. And he'd reconstructed the scene in his own mind. He spent days down there, didn't eat or sleep, just reading. Maybe it's what pushed him over. Maybe it was Jenova herself. That was the other part of the trap. Hojo wanted to know what would happen when the pinnacle of his Jenova experiment, her son, answered the call of reunion. She called to Sephiroth, and he went to her. Reunion. The unrelenting, irresistible pull that was to bring Jenova and all her pieces back together. Sephiroth had managed to take that for himself, focus the reunion on him. While Jenova isn't Sephiroth's mother, there's something of her in him. In all soldiers, really, but it's different with Sephiroth. Hojo's experiments. Cloud clenched his arms tightly, gritted his teeth before forcing himself to relax against the anger Hojo still wrought in him. Sephiroth is the result of Hojo's experiments with Jenova, and an unborn fetus. But Sephiroth is human, born of Lucretia and Hojo. He has parents. There was no denying that. As much as Hojo had tampered, Sephiroth had started out untouched by Jenova.
You can be the one to tell him that.
Cloud started, not having expected the interruption, before letting out a bark of laughter. He shoved his sword aside so he could slide down into a sitting position.
Yeah, I'll get right on that.
Running a hand through his hair, he pressed briefly against his temples as he sighed, then let his hand drop into his lap. He didn't have a headache, but it felt like he should.
Sorry. You wanted to know about him coming back. Nah, I get it,
Zack said, waving a hand dismissively. He looked stressed, face tense, and eyes distant. When Cloud risked a look up at him, dropping his eyes back to his hands in his lap, he continued.
After he'd read all he could, Sephiroth came to the conclusion that he was better than humans, that the planet was his and his mother's. So he destroyed the town, and then went up to the reactor to retrieve her. Zack and I followed, and I managed to throw him into the reactor. Even though he'd promised Zack to tell him everything, Cloud couldn't bring himself to explain the horror, the mental anguish that encounter had entailed. It wasn't important to the point anyway. He should have died. Maybe he did, but he came back. He had Jenova's head when he fell, and I think he used that as a catalyst. Shaking his head, he remembered another set of slit green eyes and their desperate triumph when they'd finally and decisively retrieved the piece of Jenova. It's not just that, I think.
Sephiroth's will. He won't let himself disappear. Genova is just his means to return, and probably why his spirit can last even after death. It was a few years before he did return, though. My friends and I managed to defeat him in the end. But even then, he managed to bring me to him in the live stream. I defeated him there, too. I saw him disperse, and I thought he was gone for good.
I will never be just a memory.
A few years later,
Cloud said on a sigh, pushing the other's words away.
People were getting sick. The planet was sick. Sephiroth hadn't dispersed, but had infected it. Infected people. He was able to return again using a piece of Genova and another's body.
It was more complicated than that, though half of it Cloud wasn't sure he understood either. He'd barely been aware of the remnants before they attacked him, and Rufus hadn't been forthcoming about information before or after the events that led to Sephiroth's brief return. Zack let out a low whistle, brow furrowed thoughtfully.
All right, so question. Mind giving me the cliff notes on this livestream business?
Cloud gave him a blank look.
Didn't I already tell you about it? No?
Oh, to be fair, Cloud kept forgetting that knowledge of the live stream wasn't commonplace here. He'd been so involved in it, especially in the last few years before his arrival in the past, that it was ingrained. Giving a self-deprecating chuckle, he shook his head.
Then I expect half of what I've been saying makes no sense, right? Nothing you say ever makes sense, buddy.
Wow.
Rude.
He jabbed at Zack's kneecap, relishing the pained yelp as Zack flinched away. After rubbing at his injury and sending Cloud a petulant pout, he swung Buster Sword off his back and plopped down next to him. Cloud resisted the urge to shift away from, or into, the heat radiating at his side. He swore Zack had no sense of personal space.
I'm not the best person to explain this either,
he warned.
Nanaki, my friend, and his grandfather tried for years to explain the subtleties, but all I got out of it was that the life stream is the lifeblood of the planet. It's what makes up everything. It's where everything comes from, and where everything returns to after death. Anything alive is part of it, and it's what Shinra refines into Mako energy.
Zack's expression wrinkled into consternation, frown deepening.
So basically Shinra is what? Showering us with the planet's blood?
Exposing soldiers to diluted but pure life energy. Yeah, basically.
What you're telling me is that if we have to take Sephiroth out, he's, what, going to become a festering wound in this live stream?
It depends,
Cloud hedged,
on if anything has changed. Whether he hates enough to come back.
I don't understand how anyone can be that stubborn. I mean, I guess if it was anyone it'd be him, but to come back from death?
Cloud rubbed the fabric of his pant leg between his fingers, not looking up.
That's why we need to be sure to destroy Genova, whatever else happens. His will might be enough to keep him from dispersing back into the life stream, but without her cells, without her physical catalyst.
Zack pressed his lips into a thin line.
And what about us soldiers? Most soldiers have inactive Genova cells in them. They're already dead.
The tense line of Zack's shoulders relaxed a little.
So he can't use them?
He stiffened again a heartbeat later and turned to look more fully at Cloud.
But what about you?
A dark expression crossed Cloud's face.
Hojo's experiments on me were with live Genova cells and other things. He was trying to make me into a clone of Sephiroth. not understanding how it worked. I'm probably the most likely vessel Sephiroth could use to come back. If Cloud let him, if his determination failed. Part of him wondered if the reason for the remnants had been because of his continued stubbornness at driving off the painful visions Sephiroth had inflicted through the geostigma infection. He attributed most of that to Aerith's gentle influence, however. Even from the live stream, she'd always looked out for him, for all of them.
We just have to make sure it doesn't come to that,
Zack said, voice hard with his usual conviction. He frowned a moment later, eyes tracking restlessly back and forth over the dirt between them.
Man, it's been bugging me since we talked about all this the first time, back near the Chocobo Ranch. I swear I've heard some of these terms before. Ancients and Genova. It's right there.
Professor Gast was one of the scientists, along with Hojo, who originally found Genova. Cloud offered.
They thought she was an ancient and could lead them to the Promised Land.
More fool them for thinking there was such a paradise hidden away on the planet. They had no idea what they were really searching for. Cloud had touched that place. That wasn't life, and not quite death either. In the few times Aerith had allowed such visits.
If you heard anything from Shinra, that could be why they seem familiar. No, it's not that. It's...
Zack trailed off.
Ancients. Damn it, why is that so familiar? I know I've heard it somewhere before.
His closed fist smacked into the open palm of his other hand suddenly, his expression lighting with epiphany.
That's it! Hollander's stolen files! That's where I've heard the term before. Hollander is the scientist who was competing against Hojo?
Cloud recalled slowly. Zack nodded.
He holed up in Reactor 5 in Midgar. Hollander was using the research he stole to create copies of Genesis and Angeal. All of the soldiers Genesis took with him,
he said, his fingers curling into tight fists that made the leather creak.
All of them were turned into Genesis copies, and he threw them at us. His own personal army.
The disgust and anger in Zack's voice was clear.
The Angeal copies were made with monsters, at least.
His expression cleared again, and he looked down at the ground.
Both of them were the product of Hollander's experiment. I guess he and Hojo had the same goals.
He paused and seemed to be thinking hard again. Running a hand over his forehead and hair, he shook his head.
I think that's where I first heard the name, too. Genova. From Hojo. He said something when Genesis came after him about uneducated minds classifying any unknown thing as an ancient. I don't know. That whole time is really muddled for me.
Cloud knew the feeling. He had thought, hoped, really, that Hojo could be the only person sick enough, insane enough for such corrupt research. But it was all too obvious that he was only one mind of many in Shinra. Yet after Sephiroth's fall, in all that time that Cloud remembered, he didn't recall any mention of the other scientists or their projects. Had the other Sephiroth eliminated all of his competition? Or were they the failures that Hojo had claimed? There was something that still nagged at him, an incessant clawing at the back of his mind that was almost as strong as the call itself in his need to know.
Did any of the clones ever speak of a reunion?
He managed after the silence had stretched between them. He could remember the pitiful shapes huddled in black robes, the number emblazoned on their hand as a mark of their compatibility to Hojo's great, insane plan. Were there others out there, other clones without the distinctive mark, that had been waiting to bring their own madness should Sephiroth give them the opportunity to rise? Or had Hojo been right in that he was the only one to succeed
in his Genova reunion theory.
Reunion?
Zack asked.
I don't remember hearing anything about that, no. They really don't talk, just fought. And died.
He frowned, shaking his head.
What is the reunion?
It's... Cloud swallowed, picking at his gloves.
A theory of Hojo's, that the pieces of Genova would call out to each other. And, well, as the name implies, the other Sephiroth was able to control the call. Them as well as you, huh?
Zack went quiet, ruminating over the implications for a short while. Around them, the breeze whistled along the rocks and shrub bush. At last he said,
I guess whatever it was that Hollander did was different than what Hojo did. Hojo kept calling them both failures. Hollander's freak show.
His jaw clenched for a moment, before relaxing.
Hollander claimed that Angeal was perfect, a two-way conduit that had inherited Genova's power completely. Angeal could... I don't really understand it myself, but he could copy his genetic traits and pass them on, I guess. That's how he put it anyway. He was able to merge with his copies, make himself some sort of monster.
Zack released a weighty breath and closed his eyes. He looked tired, weary, hurt, but in a way relieved. The haunted look that had scarred his face when he spoke of Hollander was smoothing away, and Cloud wondered if Zack had told anyone this before. He doubted it. Who would he tell? The only person Zack could trust with this was Aerith, and he didn't want to put her in danger. Cloud knew all too well what bottling up painful memories would do to you. He was happy, at least, that he could be here for Zack.
I wish Angeal didn't have to die, but I think, in the end, he thought what he was doing was the right thing. He said that our enemy was those who created suffering, that he had created his own suffering.
Zack swallowed hard.
So, in the end, I think he was at peace.
He gave Cloud a sideways look, and he shook his head, a small smile crawling into place.
That's a little off topic though, isn't it? Listen to us, rambling like a couple of old men on a fishing trip.
Cloud shook his head, refuting the assertion.
No, it's important. The past. You can't let it control you, but you need to remember it to move forward.
Zack's slow smile took on a familiar quirk that Cloud was coming to recognize as quiet pride. He was seeing that expression more and more these days, but it never failed to make him flush warmly with pleasure. It was such a stark contrast from Zack's normal exuberance, earnest in a different way. So it struck home that much harder that Cloud was doing things right this time. A pang of homesickness shot through him as he wondered if Tifa would have been just as proud to see him keeping his promise.
Or, in your case, your past future? Future past? One of those, anyway.
Zack waved his hand as if to encompass the enormity of Cloud's strange history.
Hey, Zack?
Zack's head lolled towards him, his cheek pressing against his shoulder guard.
Yeah, buddy?
Shifting uncomfortably, Cloud wished the words back in his mouth. He hadn't meant to say anything, but now that Zack acknowledged him, it was unlikely he would let Cloud go without saying what was on his mind.
Do you think we can trust anyone else?
With which bits?
Zack shot back dryly.
Well,
he said slowly,
all of it.
One thing Cloud sorely missed was having people, friends, to support him in all his terrible decisions. Zack was the best partner in crime he could have, but he was only one person. Maybe it was because Tifa was still on his mind. Her objection against him going it alone, his promise to do better. They were doing all they could, yet it didn't seem like enough. Another set of dependable eyes, a different opinion and way of looking at things. They needed something to give them an edge. So long as Zack was there to back him up, he felt he could share most of it with someone else. Someone they both trusted. He had a hunch. Leaning forward, Zack dropped his chin to his hands, staring hard at the dry grass and rock.
There are a few people I trust, but there are only 2 others I trust entirely, who aren't dead or, part of the problem.
He held up his free hand, one finger first.
Aerith.
A second finger.
And Kunzel.
As he's expected.
And Aerith? I don't really want to get her involved, but we should start thinking of how to tell her. A lot of this concerns her,
He hummed in agreement.
She'll be fine,
he assured quietly.
She's strong enough to take care of herself.
And the world, if it came down to it. But no, he shouldn't be pushing the deeds of the other onto this Aerith, even if he believed she had the same potential.
I know,
Zack said, running a hand through his hair roughly.
It just doesn't seem right, dragging her into the messes I get into when she's happy.
A vision of Aerith propped into his mind, hair mussed and a beautiful smile on her face. Cloud sank his face into his scarf as he willed away the rising flush.
She's happy when she's in your messes, though.
Zack slung an arm around Cloud's shoulder, much to his mortification, and gave him a squeeze.
Yeah, you might be right. We'll deal with that when we get there. Anyway, back to Sephiroth. I had a question or two for you. How does he measure up against the simulation, against the other one you fought? How are we doing preparing?
Resigned to his suffering, he allowed himself to lean into Zack's embrace just a bit.
The simulation it's a pretty good comparison of how Sephiroth is now. Not as versatile.
And the eyes were still unsettlingly blank in his opinion.
Because of that, it's not as strong. Sephiroth is adaptable, the simulation less so. Still, the patterns are similar, and the way he moves. But
he felt the need to protest.
I haven't really had a chance to fight him. We always get interrupted. Not surprising. It's probably made from the data gathered when Sephiroth uses the training room, and the routine soldier physicals. I wonder if he uses it as a sparring partner himself.
Cloud's eyes widened, and his elbow jerked reflexively into Zack's side. He tried not to let his mind wander down that path of what it would be like to fight against both of them, and failing that, elbowed Zack again harder. Zack grunted and untangled himself from Cloud, his head swiveling to give Cloud a wounded look.
What was that for? Just assume you deserved it,
Cloud muttered. Skies above, he was not going to get the image of 2 calculating, piercing gazers sizing him up out of his mind for a long while. Clearing his throat before Zack could protest, he continued quickly.
The other Sephiroth is like Sephiroth, but not. In the same way an airman is like a fly-eye, or the way an airman is like an Angro-Mainyu.
Zack said glibly.
Ha ha,
he grumbled.
No, he is otherworldly, is what I meant. He moves the same, but it's like the world has no hold on him.
Sephiroth wielding the Masamune was a deadly dance of flashing steel and relentless aggression. But the other was taunting, not bound by gravity or the pressures of the planet. He'd risen above them on willpower alone, and his smugness permeated his every action. Since Zack had relinquished his hold, Cloud slumped so he could lie fully on the ground as he tucked his arms behind his head. His sword was an annoying pressure on his back, but he couldn't bother himself to move at this point.
At Nibelheim, when he first let go, that was when he was most like this Sephiroth. But after he fell into the life stream, he lost his body and what was left of his humanity. Sometimes he would appear,
but only as a ghost, a spectre that you couldn't touch. Other times he would have a physical body. I think he used His breath caught for a moment, and he had to clear his throat to continue.
One of the successful clone bodies.
He preferred not to engage us directly, mostly just mind games, or sending monsters born of Genova to delay us. It was like he was playing a game, that we were all pawns of his whim, or puppets.
Fighting him directly is like trying to fight the wind. So, stronger and faster then?
Brought out of his musings, he looked up into Zach's amused expression. Rolling his eyes, he tilted his head in assent.
Simply, yeah. But it's not just strength. I can beat him in a fight, if it comes down to it. It's just...
his force is more overwhelming. He can get in your head, and it's so hard to fight.
With any luck, we'll never have to face him like that,
Zach said, reaching out and ruffling Cloud's bangs. Before he could respond, a sudden, sharp scream rent the air from further down the ravine. His immediate thought was for the chocobo who had been out of sight for too long. But the scream had been decidedly human. Cloud jerked up in tandem with Zach, leaping to his feet. However, Cloud's sword caught awkwardly against the ground, causing him to flail and nearly pitch over on his face. A moment later, Zach's boots thumped into his leg, and he went down over Cloud's back with an abortive exclamation, Buster Sword exacerbating his tumble. For a few breaths, all Cloud could do was stare blankly as Zach flailed like an overturned adamantine eye. This was probably the least graceful they'd been since their abortive first fight against the Sephiroth simulation. Later, he expected Zach would laugh about this. By the time they had clumsily regained their feet, another loud call echoed along the rocky walls of the gulch, and this time it was definitely a chocobo's walk. Zach looked over at him, wide-eyed, hair mussed, and clothes dusty.
Cloud, where did Viri go?
Sephiroth was going to kill them.
It's your mission, sir.
Zach waved a finger at him.
No way! You're the official chocobo babysitter here. If anything happens to that bird, you get to go explain it to Sephiroth.
He leapt into motion, charging off up the gorge, with Cloud only a heartbeat behind.
Aren't you supposed to ensure your charges get back unmolested?
Cloud countered. He tried to judge how close Viri was. His warble had been lacking a distressed edge, so he was probably fine wherever he'd gotten to. But the other scream had made him worried. Who else was out here? Zach swatted at him, laughing.
I'll give you unmolested.
Yes, please. The stray thought caused Cloud to stumble, face burning from more than just exertion. Zach glanced back over his shoulder questioningly, but didn't get a chance to ask anything before they reached a rocky field where the gorge split off in 3 directions.
Which way do you think?
Zach asked, skidding to a stop. Cloud's boots slid in the gravel as he pulled up next to him, almost as soon as he stopped, and before either of them could really comprehend what was happening, the first of the calm fangs struck. With no momentum to use to move out of the way in time, he was unable to dodge the first 2 bodies that lunged at him from their rocky hiding places. Instead, in one motion, he drew his sword and swung it like a club. He caught the first monster under its ribs with the flat of the blade, before hurling it into its partner and sending both smashing into the side of the gorge wall. Behind him, Zach made a surprised sound, his boots scraping against the dirt as he adjusted his stance.
I guess we found that pack we were looking for,
he said, voice cheerful as he pulled Buster Sword off his back. Cloud heard the low sound of resonant growling, as more of the beasts eased their way through the rocky forest around them.
Lucky,
Cloud grunted as he skipped back a step, coming shoulder to shoulder with Zach.
I wouldn't call what we were doing looking. Hey now!
Zack shot back gleefully.
You don't make it to first without some skill, you know.
As if to prove it, he lunged forward and smacked one of the Calmfang's back with the flat of Buster Sword's blade.
Oh, come on. Why can't you lot give up and go home? Stay away from people and we won't have to fight you.
Cloud ducked under the backswing of the Buster Sword, since he'd followed too closely behind Zack's lunge, before bracing one hand against Zack's shoulder guard. He pushed a little harder than he needed to boost himself forward, his boots striking the muzzle of another monster. Tenaciously, it tried to bite him through the thick leather, until his momentum carried his full weight into the beast's face. The sound of its neck snapping was lost in its brethren's snarls and howls. There was a yelp of surprise as one of the monsters used the chance to leap onto Zack's back from atop a nearby rock spire. Zack reached back and managed to snag the beast's thick neck ruff and haul it over his shoulder. He twisted Buster Sword and jammed the blunt edge of the blade into the beast's neck as it came back at him, sending it to the ground spluttering and unable to get air through its ruined trachea.
There are a lot,
Cloud said mildly. He spun in a quick arc, his sword scoring a deep gash across one of the monster's eyes. A second jab went right through its heart, and Cloud kicked the twitching carcass off his blade before it could collapse and trap his weapon under it. He frowned as another half-dozen of the creatures appeared from around the bend in the gorge, their eyes shining with battle lust as they joined the fray.
What's got them so worked up?
Zack growled, adjusting his grip on his sword so he could lash out with a closed fist. The blow caught the beast in the head, knocking it out, and Zack finished it off with a blow from his sword.
Man, don't tell me we wandered into their den or something.
Cloud grunted as he flipped into the air to avoid another lunging beast. He landed nimbly, then gathered his power. With a practiced swing, the pulse of his attack split, sending 3 deep gouges into the earth and surrounding monsters.
Then I won't tell you,
he replied, once the shock wave died out.
Yeah,
Zack muttered. He swung Buster Sword up and returned the sword to his back, then brought his fists up.
It just figures that Sephiroth's terror bird takes off and leaves the hard work to us.
He kicked off the ground in a sudden lunge and drove one of the wolves into the air with a well-placed kick before slamming it into the nearby wall with a flurry of blows. Zack flipped around, grabbed another wolf, and tossed it up to give it a similar treatment before landing back beside Cloud and yanking Buster Sword free again. There was no need for him to have pulled his blade, however. With that last attack, the majority of the pack had turned tail and made a break for the center fork of the gorge. One of the monsters passed a few feet from Cloud, turning a snarling muzzle in his direction, but didn't stop as it charged away. Straightening, Cloud raised an eyebrow at Zack, silently asking if they were going to pursue them now. Zack shook his head.
Let them go. We'll report that we ousted them from their den site, and if the attacks start up again, they can post a new mission. For now, we need to make sure Beery and that little brat are all right.
Right. That was the other reason they were out here. Cloud had honestly forgotten both of their mission goals in the heavy talk of before. He cleaned his sword and returned it to its sheath before letting out a piercing whistle. As before, Veery immediately gave a responding walk. By the sounds of it, he was a distance away down the left fork of the road. Though with how much the gorge twisted and turned, that might be a bit misleading. In fact, Cloud and Zack had barely gone a few steps before he came charging around the corner, head down as he raced along. Cloud grinned when Zack jumped aside, obviously thinking the bird wasn't going to be able to stop in time. But Fury slid to a halt, inches from Cloud's boots, with a pleased wobble. He didn't appear harmed or spooked, so the Fang must not have caught his scent when they set up their ambush, though he had probably alerted the monsters to his and Zack's presence.
Welcome back, Birdbrain. Don't look so proud of yourself. Sheesh.
Absently ruffling Veery's neck feathers, Cloud nodded up the road.
Your lost treasure should be that way.
Zack heaved a theatrical sigh.
If only.
Blinking, because he hadn't expected that response, Cloud could only ask in confusion.
If only what?
He'd meant to tease Zack about the little girl. Without responding, Zack gave an agreeable nod and set off ahead of Cloud. Still baffled, Cloud echoed a bit louder.
If only what, Zack?
He still didn't get an answer as Zack disappeared around the corner. Looking down at Veery, Cloud gave a helpless shrug. It wasn't the first time Zack had turned a joke back on Cloud like that, nor the first time the joke went over Cloud's head. He chased after Zack, catching up after a few seconds, with Veery trotting obediently next to him. Veery's footsteps were silent and sure-footed as he paced along, his head craning around in interest, as if he hadn't passed that way a few moments ago. The pathway wound further downward, at a slight grade, and at the end they found it opened up into a decent-sized depression. The walls of the gorge rose around them, casting cool shadows, but at the center, where the most sunlight shone, a thick little forest had prospered. The trees were hardy, with twisted, tall trunks and thick, leafy canopies. Zack walked towards them, slowly turning around as he went.
One with the eagle eye and a keen sense of balance.
The sudden voice was young-sounding, and there was no doubt it was the girl Zack was looking for.
Two with the courage and intelligence unlike any other.
Zack turned around, squinting at the forest.
Three, defeater of terrible monsters everywhere.
There was a sudden yelp, and Cloud and Zack looked over in time to see the branches of one of the trees tremble. Zack coughed, probably to cover a laugh, and strode over to the tree where he stopped and propped his hands on his hips.
Can you get down?
He asked after a moment. There was a faint huff from the girl. Cloud frowned. It sounded familiar somehow.
Of course I can. I'm the great treasure princess.
Very familiar. But surely there was no way.
All right then,
Zack said.
I guess we'll just leave you to it then.
But,
the voice said loudly as he turned and made to leave,
you can catch me just to make yourself useful.
Grinning, Zack turned back towards the tree and held his arms up.
Sure thing, kid.
The branches trembled again, a few of the leaves falling loose to rain down around Zack, and a moment later a figure in dark green, lined with yellow, dropped down. He caught her easily in his arms, then deposited her safely on the ground.
Ugh,
the girl groaned.
Now I have ugly soldier dude germs on me.
Hey.
Cloud stared at the girl as she flailed around and mimed gagging at the thought of Zack's touch. It was impossible for so many reasons, but somehow seemed almost inevitable. So much younger, yet the girl was without a doubt.
Yuffie?
Zack and Yuffie looked at him at the same time, their words tumbling over each other in a chorus of surprise.
Hey, how do you know my name? Who are you?
You know her?
Yuffie gave him a second, more thorough look, then rounded on Zack.
I get it. You're going to try and trap me, aren't you? I'm onto your ploys, Shinra scum.
What? I'm doing no such thing. I came out here to...
Despite Zack's splutters, it was obvious that Yuffie wasn't listening, as she made a concerted effort to punch Zack in the stomach. Zack was, quite obviously, unfazed.
Bam! Pow! I'll take you both on. Just wait and see.
Yuffie boasted. She flipped back away from Zack and snubbed her nose at them. Zack crossed his arms over his chest and frowned at her.
Now tell me how you know who I am, or face the mighty wrath of Wutai's greatest warrior.
Cloud was very, very close to putting his head in his hands, torn between horrified amusement at their predicament and a giddy sort of happiness at seeing Yuffie again. However different she was, This was not the brash and confident teen he'd known, who had grown and matured over the years, yet kept that spark of defiance no matter what odds she was dealt. This was a mere child, who couldn't be any older than Denzel had been. Still, here she was traipsing around the world on her own, defying someone's authority. It was so achingly familiar that he had to fight down a genuine smile. If she was anything like the person he'd known, then at least he was confident he could handle her mercurial moods.
Oh, come on,
Zack said, sounding both frustrated and exasperated, and still somehow amused.
You're the one who keeps sending me messages.
Yuffie's face crumpled, eyes scrunching up and a hand coming to press over them. She sniveled loudly. She hiccuped.
I want my treasure!
With another loud sniff, she turned around and took off. Unless there was another way out of here, she was going to be trapped by the walls of the gorge.
Hey!
Zack yelped, starting to chase after her.
Get back here!
Cloud reached out and snagged his arm when he passed, pulling him to a halt.
Zack,
he said, a bit louder than necessary.
We have other duties to attend to. Just leave her.
Zack gave him a bewildered look.
What? Cloud? What?
Shaking his head, Cloud allowed a ghost of a smile to pass across his face and silently indicated the direction she went with a flick of his eyes. Trust me. That, at least, Zack seemed to understand, even if he still looked lost as to what Cloud was up to. If it was one thing Yuffie hated, it was being ignored. Using his grip on his arm to tug Zack into motion, Cloud started to lead them away, deliberately turning their back on where Yuffie had disappeared to. Sure enough, a moment later there was an affronted, "Hey!" Cloud grinned smugly, his smile widening a fraction when another, louder exclamation followed it. A second later, Yuffie came tearing back around towards them. She didn't stop either, just kept going and ducked around behind Zack, grabbing onto his belt loops and leaning around him.
"Kill it!"
she yelped, pointing viciously.
"You're supposed to be some big tough monster slayer, aren't you?"
Veery came trotting up after her. If Cloud had any doubt to what Sephiroth was teaching the bird, it was wiped away at the bird's smug strut as Veery came to a stop at his side. He looked entirely too pleased with himself. Cloud gave him an approving scratch, petting at his neck feathers as he watched the byplay unfold in front of him.
I thought you were Wutai's greatest warrior,
Zack said, craning his head around to look at her huddled behind him.
and here you are afraid of a giant fuzzball.
Yuffie socked him in the side before stepping away and dropping to the ground, cross-legged, and crossed her arms over her chest.
"Shut up! I could take it if I wanted to."
Zack heaved an explosive sigh and crouched down beside Yuffie as she sulked.
Why are you still going into these dangerous places?
He asked. Yuffie stuck her nose into the air with a sniff.
"I don't know what you're talking about."
Boy, oh boy.
Zack said with a sigh, exasperation thick in his voice.
Look, I know those anonymous messages cluttering up my spam folder are from you.
Yuffie's sulk only became more pronounced, and she threw a dark glare in Veery's direction, then threw her hands in the air.
"Fine, I admit it. I sent them all. And no, I haven't been. It's all your fault, too,"
she yelled, jabbing a finger into Zack's chest. Zack gaped at her.
What? My fault? What are you talking about?
He spluttered.
"You haven't been doing your job and killing the monsters so I can get to the treasure."
Zack looked up at Cloud, looking baffled and a little helpless. They'd be here for hours chasing after Yuffie if it was up to her. Luckily, it wasn't. Cloud gave Veery one final pat before leaning down and whispering some simple commands mixed with plain-worded instructions to the bird. He didn't know if Veery would really understand at this point, but by the way the bird rumbled in response and trotted off, he was fairly confident the trick would work. Now all he had to do was get Yuffie in the proper frame of mind.
We should head to Calm,
he said to Zack, ignoring Yuffie completely. This was twice he'd snubbed her. Zack gave him another perplexed look, but nodded gamely as he straightened.
You're probably right.
Hey, wait a minute, buddy. Do you know who I am?
Yuffie demanded, bounding to her feet and pointing an indignant finger in Cloud's direction. He finally looked at her and raised a sardonic eyebrow as he replied.
Eagle-eyed, keen of balance, courageous and intelligent, defeater of monsters, and the treasure princess.
Zack clamped a hand over his mouth to try to muffle his snort of amusement, and Cloud could admit it probably sounded absurd coming from him. Yuffie looked torn between embarrassment and pride.
Well, yeah, that's right,
she said, trying to gain the upper hand again. He wasn't inclined to let her.
Are you coming to Calm with us?
He asked, but didn't wait for an answer. Tilting his head at Zack, he indicated they should start walking.
What are you up to?
Zack hissed when they were a few feet away.
We're not just going to leave her here, right?
Cloud shook his head and held up his hand placatingly. It wouldn't be long.
Hey, you can't just walk off. I'm not done with you yet, you spiky-haired jerk.
Yuffie hollered after them, propping her fists on her hips, stance wide.
Hey!
Cloud turned his head slightly and gave a sharp whistle. The sound of rapid footsteps approached from behind, and before she could move, Veery had ducked under her legs, scooping her onto his back as he ran after them. Yuffie's high-pitched scream of terror was muffled by the way she buried her face into Veery's feathers as she clung onto his neck with all her strength. Veery didn't stop when he caught up, just ran ahead in his exuberance at his passenger despite her loud protests. Cloud tried to tell himself it was a practical use of transportation, but couldn't quite stifle his snickers. Beside him, Zack grinned widely. He obviously had no such compunctions. After a moment, Cloud noticed he was staring at Zack again. Well, it was a nice day, so a little indulgence was okay. With a nod at him, Zack headed off after the chocobo, and Cloud followed. It wasn't that far back to Calm, at least.
Are we there yet?
The question was asked in a bored monotone, with a faint twinge of a whine. A few seconds later it was repeated.
Are we there yet?
Zack glanced over at Yuffie, still astride Veery, but no longer terrified. The bird walked placidly between him and Cloud, with Yuffie practically draped across his neck. She looked a bit green around the gills, but otherwise hadn't suffered too badly from her wild ride. Zack couldn't say the same for a rock a few miles back. "Nope," he said, just a little too cheerfully. She'd been repeating that question for the last 5 to 10 minutes. He'd stopped trying to time her after the 50th repetition. "'Fraid not." Yuffie sent him a look of utmost misery and boredom. How she managed to pull that off, he had no idea.
How about now?
"No. Are we... Would you put a lid on it, you scrawny little worm?" he yelped at last, his frustration finally eating through. Yuffie sat up, as if she'd been electrocuted.
Hey! Who are you calling a worm, you edge-head-faced moron? And I'll have you know my body is a well-trained weapon.
Zack snorted loudly. "At least I don't still pick my nose." She let out a rather impassive snarl, and brought a fist up with clear intent to take a swing at him. At precisely that moment, Veery's even pace stumbled a little, and she gave an unhappy gurgle, quickly clamped a hand over her mouth, and clung to the bird's neck again. Zack thought he felt a little too proud of his inadvertent victory. Really, she was just a brat. He was supposed to be the mature adult here.
"I'll have you know you owe me lunch for the one I lost," she said with a moan. "This is horrible. I always knew Shinra was terrible, but this is cruel and unusual. What kind of people are you?"
"Your wrist," Cloud said out of the blue. It was the first thing he'd said since they'd left the gorge. Zack glanced over, bemused. At the same time Yuffie did. She stared for a moment before turning back to Zack, and in a stage whisper said,
The new guy is crazy. Maybe you should put in for a new partner.
Give me your wrist, Cloud repeated, holding up a gloved hand and flexing his fingers coaxingly. Yuffie squinted at him suspiciously.
Why? You going to tie me up now?
Of course, Cloud replied mildly. He had a slight grin on his face. But you can get out of any binding I do, couldn't you?
Ha! Of course I could!
Yuffie said boastfully. With a smug smirk, she extended an arm.
Just you try it! I'll show you how great I am, Buster!
Zack could only look on, in increasing bafflement, and maybe just a tiny bit of envy. It had taken him a long time to get Cloud comfortable enough around him to act so playful and relaxed. Seeing him settle in so easily with the little monkey was perplexing at best, and a little disheartening given Cloud's recent regression into near-complete touch-me-not mode. He consoled himself, remembering their earlier conversation. Cloud was still his close friend, even if he'd been acting downright weird lately. And Zack felt a little silly for being bothered by it in the first place. He knew things about Cloud that no one else did, and Cloud knew things about Zack that he'd never told anyone. Being able to talk to someone about Angeal, Hollander, and Genesis, and feel like they got it, the way Cloud did, was one of the most relieving things he'd ever felt. It was second only to the feeling of relief when he'd made his peace with Sephiroth over Angeal. Looking over at Cloud, he felt his mouth twitch back up into a smile. He'd never had a best friend before, though Kunzel was close to it. He had never really liked to define a friend as best. It always seemed silly when he considered all of his friends to be important and special in their own ways. But if he did, it was definitely Cloud. Zack darted his gaze back to Yuffie as she gave a nasty gulping sound and clung more tightly to Viri's feathery neck. I wonder how he knew her. It was hard to believe the obnoxious little brat that he'd met in Wutai and that had plagued him afterwards was someone Cloud would want to associate with. He could guess that Yuffie was someone Cloud had known in that other life he'd led, and going on how quickly he was relaxing around her, Zack would bet they'd been at least close friends. It was good, he decided in the end. Cloud needed all the friends he could get. The guy was only beat at being an antisocial shut-in by Sephiroth. He was getting better, but one could never have too many allies, even if they were in the form of a demanding little gremlin. Cloud had taken Yuffie's arm, his thumb pressed against the inside of her wrist. He kept it there for a few paces as Yuffie waited expectantly, before she realized that was all he was going to do.
Is that all? Are you mocking me?
He made a non-committal sound, though he didn't let go of her wrist. Zack watched for a few minutes as Yuffie tried to tug herself free, her movements becoming more frantic as she tried to contort out of Cloud's deceptively gentle grip. When she finally collapsed over Viri's neck in defeat, Cloud glanced down at her out of the corner of his eye. Feeling better?
Why would I be feeling better? You great big bullying...
Yuffie began heatedly, before she broke off. Sitting up again, she tilted her head to the side consideringly.
My stomach doesn't feel like it's trying to crawl out of my throat anymore.
Hey, that's right, Zack said in sudden remembrance. You used to suffer from motion sickness, didn't you, Cloud? He could well remember the rather pathetic sight of the trooper Cloud had been, crouched among a group of his concerned squadmates in Medeal. It made him wonder, suddenly, what had happened to the slightly reserved kid he'd met back in Modierheim. He supposed that kid was still in there, somewhere. That history was Cloud's, too, just... He probably shouldn't dwell on it. Thinking about things like that were bound to give him a headache straight through the Mako. It didn't matter anyway. This Cloud was his friend, and he'd considered the Cloud from before his friend as well. He'd just kind of grown used to having this one around. It's hard to imagine him any other way. The thought made him feel vaguely guilty.
I still do sometimes, when it's really bad or I try to read something, Cloud said as he breathed out a quiet sigh, before flashing Zack a wistful grin across Veery's back. I was researching medical cures once, and ran across this tip. I never had a chance to try it out before now.
That's amazing and all, Yuffie said loudly.
But are we there yet?
Actually, yeah, we are,
Zack said, glancing forward again. Ahead of them lay the outskirts of Calm. Between them and the little township itself, there was a wide, grassy area with a fenced-in swath of grass that had been visibly worn down in a circle pattern until it was a track of dirt. At the far end, he could see a large gathering of people, and the stalls and other paraphernalia that had spilled out to accommodate the crowds coming to watch the chocobos run. Even now, the sound of chocobos jostling among each other could be heard, their walks high and challenging. Beyond the little raceway, the dusky roofs of Calm rose up.
Finally! No! You stupid bird, stop!
Yuffie's voice trailed off into a shriek as Veery perked up and took off at a swift trot towards the racetrack, forcing Cloud to release his grip or pull her right off his back. A loud sound cracked through the air, signaling the start of a race. Zack wasn't sure, but he thought he saw another black form amidst the bobbing yellow bodies. Exchanging an amused look with Cloud, they both stretched out their stride, trailing after the happy young bird and his less than happy passenger. As they came level with the track, the racers were just rounding the bend of the final straightway, and there was indeed a black chocobo among them. There was also Veery on the outside of the track, doing his best to outrun the larger birds and their jockeys. Zack chortled as he realized that Veery was actually beating the pack and was neck and neck with the lead runner. Beside him, he could see Cloud's expression transform into a faint grin, and heard him mutter, "Yeah, that's Tio, all right." He was really going to have to ask about that someday. The screams and yells of the crowd grew to a crescendo as the birds crossed the finish line, and while he couldn't be sure at this angle, Zack thought Veery might have taken the lead at the end. He lost sight of the pair as Veery's momentum took him into some of the bystanders, who swiftly parted for the small bird. A bit worried that Yuffie might get into trouble, he wasn't worried at all about Sephiroth's overtrained monster killer. He hurried forward, pushing his way through the gawking crowd. In the center of a ring of bystanders, some of which were wearing the number that denoted their status as jockeys, Veery stood at attention, even as he craned his neck around at some new point of interest. Yuffie still clung to his neck, like a barnacle, with her eyes squeezed shut, and was shouting to anyone who would listen,
"This stupid monster isn't mine!"
"Excuse me, out of my way, please. Responsible caretaker's coming through,"
Zack called. Those who didn't immediately get out of his way were pushed gently but irrevocably aside as he cleared a path for Cloud and himself. There was a commotion opposite to them, and he could make out another body pushing its way through the press of people. They reached the center at the same time, and Zack thought idly that the racer looked a bit familiar, though he couldn't place the face. Whoever he was red-faced with fury. The color only deepened when he caught sight of them.
"You!"
he spluttered, jabbing a finger in Zack and Cloud's direction. Cloud pressed next to Zack's side, and Zack could see the uncharacteristic smirk that had crossed his face. "Hello, Joe," Cloud said, simply, as he laid a hand on Veery's neck proprietorily. Veery cooed happily and pressed his head into Cloud's chest. Zack raised his eyebrows in surprise. He'd never seen Cloud quite like this, confident, smug, and a touch spiteful. Well, except that time last month, when he was aching in all his joints and cranky as all get out. But even then he hadn't been quite like this. Or that time with Reno. That had been like trying to contain a sparking firecracker. Actually, now that he thought about it, Cloud had a lot of anger in him.
He just was very good at coming across as bored or disinterested. Sort of like, well, Sephiroth, if he were forced to make a comparison. Note to self, never make that comparison out loud. The jockey thrust his finger at Cloud again, too incensed or possibly too aware of their audience to do more. "You're the ones who stole my bird!" A sudden shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Zack could only see this going badly, if this wasn't cleared up and fast. They weren't much of a threat physically, but still, he'd really rather not get into it with a bunch of civilians and off-duty military men. "Huh? Isn't this General Sephiroth's bird?" The sudden voice broke through the angry mutterings, and Zack craned his neck around. He spotted a familiar pair of faces in the crowd, one scrunched in confusion, while the other split into a wide grin. "Is that—" "It is! Jack! Sparrow! What are you two doing here?" Zack asked brightly, waving the two forward. The crowd parted, eager to see where this show was headed. Beside him, Zack was aware of Yuffie, making nearly mute little sounds of horror, though he had no idea what had gotten into her now. He thought he could hear Cloud give a soft snort of laughter, too. Jack bounded up energetically, with Sparrow trailing a few feet behind. When he got even with them, Jack threw an arm around Cloud's shoulder in a merry greeting. Zack was baffled again to realize that Cloud wasn't immediately throwing off the contact. Whatever he tried these days, Cloud would find some excuse to step away as quickly as possible. Had he done anything to make Cloud mad recently? He certainly wasn't acting like he was mad at Zack. Well, aside from the no-touch thing. Maybe he should ask Aerith. Cloud might, and this was a rather big might, given how close-lipped he was, have said something to her. And if not, Aerith was always good for advice anyway. "Sparrow and I are here visiting the folks, but I wanted to stop by the track too," Jack said wistfully. "I mean, I keep hoping I'll win big someday, you know?" "Hey now, what's this about a stolen bird, friends?" One of the other jockeys stepped forward, folding his arms across his chest. He wasn't that big of a man, since they were all lightly built for their racing, but the way he glared at them made Zack want to pull off a non-existent hat and apologize profusely. The jockey turned to the angry man, who was still glaring hellfire at the side of Cloud's head. "Joe, we know you're the only one who has the knowing of breeding blacks. These guys stole your bird?" "Hey, he totally gave up on that bird," Jack protested before Zack could step in. "It was the latest hatchling from my attempts to breed Hyperion," Joe grunted, subsiding sulkily. He reached up and yanked his hat down a bit. "Managed to get itself imprinted on someone else, though. They as good as stole it anyway." "Ah, Joe," another jockey said, his voice a mix of sympathy and impatience. "You know there ain't nothing can be done then. Unless they sent someone in deliberately," the first jockey said, looking pointedly at Cloud. Maybe, Zack reflected, Cloud's renewed animosity hadn't appeared at the best moment. "Somehow," Sparrow drawled before he could think of anything to say, "I can't see General Sephiroth caring that much about a chocobo." There was a shocked silence from the people close enough to catch the low voice, as Zack and Cloud's Shinra attire became much more relevant. Someone piped up suddenly. "I heard from my sister that the general had gotten a chocobo." The whispering ratcheted up, and Zack bit back either an amused laugh or a sigh. He wasn't sure which at this point. It was then that he registered a sudden, violent motion to his side, and he turned fast. He almost expected an attack, but all he saw was Yuffie, and Veery startling as she started flailing. "Get it off! Get it off!" she hollered at the top of her lungs. "Get me off! Get me off!" Wide-eyed and almost automatically, Zack reached out and yanked her off the bird. He wasn't quite expecting the fist to the chin, though it didn't really hurt. She kicked a little too close to his groin for comfort, though, and he was this close to dropping her. "Hey, watch it!" he yelped. "Calm down!"
I should have known, she snarled vehemently. That monster belonged to that bastard.
He quickly clamped a hand over her mouth.
"Hey now, that's my superior and friend you're insulting," he scolded her over muffled sounds of rage.
After several seconds of continued struggling, she finally went limp and settled on glaring bloody murder at Veery, who'd taken refuge behind Cloud.
"If it's as you say," the first jockey said, nodding at Cloud in lieu of the preoccupied Zack, "then why isn't the general here? The bird's too young to be away from its caretaker."
He looked around surreptitiously, as if nervous Sephiroth was lurking around in the crowd. That would be a trick Zack would like to see.
"We're looking after him while Sephiroth is busy,"
Zack said, injecting plenty of matter-of-factness into his voice. This wasn't rocket science.
"Besides," he added, "Veery's a special bird, aren't you, buddy?"
Veery warbled in response. He did wonder how much he really understood. With Sephiroth acting as his mother, though, it wouldn't surprise him to know that Veery understood every word. Glancing down at the sullen form in his arms, he tentatively released Yuffie, ready to silence her if it looked like she was going to start getting abusive again, and reached over to scratch Veery under his beak. Almost immediately, Yuffie tried to elbow him in the stomach, as she shouted, "I am a great warrior!" Zack clamped a hand over her mouth again to shut her up. He was all too aware of how people around here would react to that kind of sentiment. While the Wutai weren't necessarily unheard of in the area, there was a judicious amount of discrimination and suspicion towards them. The war was still fresh in people's minds, even if they'd never had to experience any of it personally. He sometimes wondered if that's what made them so nasty about it. Most of the people he knew, himself included, were quite happy to see the back of the worst of it. If only people would just let it go. "Zack," Cloud said into the brief lull caused by Yuffie's yelling. Zack turned a hangdog look on his friend, who was scratching absently at Veery's crest. Cloud didn't say anything else, just inclined his head in the direction of the nearby town.
"You guys heading into town?"
Sparrow asked, having also noticed Cloud's movement.
"Yeah," Zack replied quickly. "As you can see, our secondary charge here is cranky and needs to eat."
Cloud turned and gave the still fuming Joe a teeth-filled grin. "Is that a problem?" Joe didn't say anything, just spat on the ground and pushed roughly back through the crowd. The jockey who'd been standing up for him shook his head before following after. With the entertainment over, most of the crowd was breaking off in preparation for the next race. Jack looked antsy as well, and kept glancing back over to the track.
"That's great, real great," he said distractedly. "Maybe you guys can stop by our place later. The family's having a big get-together after the races, and I'm sure you'd be welcome. And, shit, Sparrow! They're gonna close the betting!"
Without a backward glance, Jack dove off into the sway of the crowd and was lost from sight.
"Sometimes," Sparrow mused aloud, "I wonder why I've been friends with him for so long."
He raised a hand in farewell.
"I've got to go after him, or he'll never leave the tracks. See you around."
Unable to wave in fear of letting Yuffie's mouth have free rein again, Zack nodded after the man as he walked away. One of the jockeys lingered at Cloud's elbow, his eyes fixed on Veery. He reached out a hand as if to pet the chocobo, until Veery sidestepped the gesture. With a thoughtful hum, he gave Cloud a pointed look.
"He's a bit skittish, eh?"
the jockey asked, a hint of disapproval in his voice.
"The willful ones don't make good racers. What's his owner been teaching him, anyway?"
Brightly, Zack replied,
"Disembowelment, neck tearing, spine snapping, things like that. I think he's trying to teach him to use materia now, too."
Even Cloud sent him one of those looks, as if he suspected Zack was spinning his tall tale.
"No, seriously, I've seen him in action. Veery is downright vicious."
He nearly laughed at the look of interest that crossed Cloud's face as he turned a speculative gaze on Veery. The jockey just looked terrified and was still standing there as Zack frog-marched Yuffie away, Cloud and Veery trailing silently after. Since they were out of the shifting crowd and in the town proper, Zack turned his attention back to his captive.
"Geez, kid, do you have any sense of self-preservation?"
Yuffie made a muffled noise at him, and he sighed.
"I'll let you go, but if you start carrying on again, I'm putting you back on Veery and letting him loose on the tracks."
She immediately paled, then went green. He took that as compliance and let her go.
You are the worst assistant ever!
She kicked at the ground petulantly, sending a rock tumbling across the grass.
You better make it up to me big time.
Yeah, he said distractedly. "Or you'll fire me, right?"
He idly scanned the area around them, looking for a likely place to get some sort of lunch. Now that he thought about it, he was starting to get pretty hungry too.
"That's right,"
she said with a fierce nod of her head.
"So you better shape up, or you'll be begging for your next meal from the grace of Wutai's fierce dragon princess."
"Whatever you say, kid. Hey, Cloud, what do you think of that little place?"
he asked, indicating a little area of tables outside a building. An open-air cafe or diner of some sort. He wasn't quite ready to give up his sunshine and fresh air for a stuffy building just yet. Cloud gave him a blank, disinterested look, but shrugged his shoulders agreeably. Snorting, Zack considered he should have known better than to ask. He always did, with the vain hope that one day Cloud would be a little more enthusiastic at taking care of himself. Food was delicious! With a philosophical shrug, Zack led the way over with Yuffie sulking close behind him. There was a little sign outside the closed-off area around the tables that announced the place as the Calmlands Diner, under which sat a picture of a serene open field. He grinned faintly at the pun, and sought them a table near the low brick fence that surrounded the outside seating area. Behind him, he heard Cloud commanding Veery to stay. Yuffie shoved past him, stomping over to the table Zack was headed for, and hoisted herself up into a chair. Almost immediately her head thunked down on the tabletop. Pulling Buster Sword off his back, Zack flopped into another chair, which creaked slightly in protest to the sudden weight. He leaned his sword against the wall before scooting his chair forward closer to the table. Cloud passed behind him, depositing his sword next to Buster, and pulled a chair from a nearby table to sit in. Almost before he'd settled into his seat, with his back to the brick wall, Cloud's hair was assaulted by Veery. The bird had ignored his command to stay, and was leaning his head over the ledge, neck outstretched so he could peck at the soft blonde locks. Cloud frowned in annoyance, and shoved away at the cooing chocobo. Zack imagined, if Veery could form words, he would have been saying something like, "Hi, Cloud, I love you!" They hadn't waited long before a waiter appeared at their table with an armful of menus and asked, "What can I get you folks to drink?"
"Juice!"
Yuffie snapped huffily, snatching a proffered menu.
"Preferably Benora white apple juice."
Without another word, she'd buried her head in her menu and left the flustered waiter to gape at her. Zack shrugged helplessly. "I'll have—" Zack cut off as his phone began ringing. He pulled it out quickly and checked to see who it was. He was more than a little surprised and slightly alarmed to see that it was Sephiroth. The man rarely called him unless it was urgent. "I've got to take this." He glanced at Yuffie, the waiter, and the other nearby patrons. "Cloud can order for me. I'll be right back." Cloud gave him a concerned look, which Zack couldn't immediately reassure, until he knew more, at least. He stood up quickly and hit the button to answer the call as he walked away from the diner. He could feel Cloud's gaze boring into him as he went. "Hello?" he asked, and ducked into a quiet little niche, away from possibly listening ears. "Lazard has disappeared," Sephiroth's smooth voice answered immediately. Zack felt his blood run cold. What? He asked, baffled. Had someone attacked while they were away, or...
He's been under investigation for some time now. It was discovered that he's been embezzling company funds and was feeding them to Hollander and Genesis.
Zack swallowed, though it didn't do much good for the lump in his throat. It was just another personal feeling of betrayal in a long line of them lately. It made him feel suddenly tired and lost all over again. He wondered if Cloud had known anything about Lazard going bad. But no, not when he remembered how baffled Cloud always seemed whenever he was reminded that there was a head of soldier. As the long pause stretched on, Zack unable to think of anything to say, he became aware of a rustling sound in the background.
"What are you doing?"
he asked.
"I'm in Lazard's office,"
Sephiroth replied.
"I've only just left the meeting."
There was another pause, and Zack frowned in confusion. While it wasn't exactly new to find Sephiroth hanging around Lazard's office, he couldn't really see how the two lined up. The thoughtful sound jerked him back to the conversation.
"As I thought. He had the papers to promote Cloud ready."
Zack grimaced. He was all too aware of the fact that Cloud didn't want to become a soldier for whatever reason. It was doubtful that there was any way he could avoid it forever, and particularly now. As he was wondering how to break the news to Cloud, he heard a sudden ripping sound carrying over the phone. He straightened up from the slight slump he'd fallen into, shocked.
"Are you... Wait, never mind. I don't want to know."
He wasn't that stupid. Sephiroth had definitely just torn up their promotion papers, though he had no idea why. He had yet to figure out what Sephiroth's motives concerning Cloud were.
"Do we need to come back?"
"No," Sephiroth said evenly.
"It would be best to continue as normal. I just wanted to give you warning."
"Thanks, Sephiroth," Zack said. The phone line went dead a second later, and he snapped his phone closed. He stayed where he was a moment longer, trying to wish away the heaviness that had settled over him, and draw out his usual optimistic feelings. It didn't seem to be working too well, but he took a deep breath and headed back anyway. As he approached the table, he could see Cloud leaning back in his chair, looking mildly amused as Yuffie tried to reach over it. "You have to tell me!" she yelled. Several of the other patrons were looking rather scandalized, so Zack had a feeling this had been going on for a while. Zack slid back into his seat, tuning out Yuffie's demand to know how Cloud knew her name. His chest felt pinched and a little breathless. He'd seen Sephiroth make moves to interfere with Shinra's plans before, back when they'd both been chasing after Angeal and Genesis. The only reason Zack had ever managed to talk to Angeal had been because Sephiroth intervened. Now, Sephiroth had kept Shinra off his back and Cloud's. Though Zack couldn't fathom his motives. He hadn't gone so far since the Mithril Mines mission, and yet here he was tearing up those papers. Looking up, Zack caught Cloud's gaze across the table. Cloud quirked a questioning eyebrow at him. He gave his head a slight shake and hoped Cloud could pick up on his silent message. "I'll tell you later." He was immensely relieved when Cloud gave a tiny nod and turned his attention back to the affronted Yuffie. He had no idea what all this meant for their plans. It felt a little too much like Sephiroth was onto them for his peace of mind, or onto something at least. He hoped they could pull this off.